There is a god in the Sumerian tablets who should not have helped us. His brother wanted us dead. The council voted against us. The other gods had already moved on, already decided that the experiment was finished, already chosen the next version of the world that did not include human beings inside it. And by every measure of what the ancient texts describe as divine authority, that decision was final. The assembly of the great gods had spoken. The flood was coming. The silence was already being prepared for the earth. And then Enki did something. He always did something. That is what is strange about this particular god when you read the Sumerian tablets, not as mythology, not as metaphor, not as the primitive dreams of people who did not understand thunder or rain, but as what a growing number of researchers, translators, and comparative mythologists are now beginning to argue they actually are. Records, compressed, encoded, written in a symbolic language that was never meant to survive this long, but survived anyway because the clay did not burn when the libraries did, because someone buried the tablets before the armies arrived, because some things are harder to destroy than the people who made them. Enki appears in those records as something that does not fit cleanly into the story the other gods are telling. He is the god of wisdom, yes. The god of water, of the deep aquifer they called the Abzu, the primordial sweet water that the Sumerians believed existed beneath the surface of the earth in a vast subterranean ocean, accessible only to those with the right knowledge or the right divinity. He is the craftsman god, the one who designed the human genetic template, who mixed the divine blood of a slain god called Wi'ila into the clay, alongside the birth mother Ninmah, and produced the creature that would be called Lulu, the mixed one, the worker, the thing that was supposed to dig the irrigation canals and tend the fields and perform the labor that had previously fallen to the junior gods, the Igigi, who had rebelled. That is what the tablets say he made us for. That is the official version of why we exist. But then something happened that the official version does not explain. Enki kept saving us. Not once. Not by accident. Not in ways that could be dismissed as a god simply protecting his investment or maintaining a useful labor force. 9 times, by the count that emerges when you read across the full corpus of Sumerian, Akkadian, and Babylonian texts that preserve his actions, 9 distinct moments where the extinction of humanity was either certain or probable, and where Enki intervened in ways that were either explicitly forbidden, technically deceptive, or so carefully hidden from the divine council that the other gods did not realize what he had done until it was too late to undo it. 9 times where the being who helped create us decided, against the apparent consensus of his own kind, that we should continue. This video ranks those 9 moments, not chronologically, not by how famous they are in the ancient astronaut literature, or how thoroughly they have been covered in the popular press, or how many times they have appeared in television documentaries about the Anunnaki, by how close it actually was, by how thin the margin was between a world that still had human beings in it and a world that did not. From the interventions where Enki had room to maneuver, where the outcome was probably going to work out, all the way down to the moments that came within what the tablets describe in terms that translate, with uncomfortable precision, as a single night, a single dream, a single wall. We are going to work through all 9 of these moments in depth. We are going to read what the tablets actually say, not what the popular summaries say they say. We are going to spend time with the original sources, with the scholarly translations, with the arguments that serious cuneiformists and mythologists have made about what these texts mean when you take them seriously, rather than reducing them to ancient metaphors for natural phenomena. And by the time we get to number 1, the closest call of all, you are going to understand something about Enki that the standard mythology courses do not teach. Something that changes the question from why did this god save humanity to why did this god need to save humanity 9 separate times, and what does it mean that the answer to both questions involves the same being making decisions that should not have been his to make, under circumstances that grew more desperate each time. Let us begin at the bottom of the list, with number 9, and work our way toward the beginning of everything. Quick pause, and this is something new. For the first time since the 12 codes, there is a second document. It is called the 7 Resets. Every time the world was erased, matched against the king list chronology, and the checklist of signs for the 8th. 4 are already active. Linked below, QR code on screen. That is all. Back to the video. 9. The moment Enki gave humanity the components of civilization without authorization. This one ranks 9th, not because it was unimportant, but because the threat it addressed was distributed across time in a way that made it less immediately lethal than the events higher on this list. The danger here was not sudden extinction. It was something slower, more systematic, and in certain ways, more permanent. the deliberate maintenance of human beings in a state of cognitive and cultural limitation that would have made every subsequent catastrophe on this list unsurvivable. The threat was not killing us. It was making us permanently too small to save ourselves. To understand what Enki did here, you have to understand what the Sumerian texts describe as the me. The me are one of the most discussed and least understood concepts in the entire cuneiform textual tradition. The word appears hundreds of times across the tablets. Scholars have spent considerable effort trying to pin down a precise translation, and the options they have settled on include divine laws, divine attributes, the gifts of civilization, the sacred powers, and the offices of civilization. Every one of these translations captures something. None of them captures everything. And the thing that all of them together fail to capture is perhaps the most important characteristic of the me as the tablets describe them. They are physical. They are objects. Not abstract principles that are somehow embodied in divine authority, not metaphors for cultural values that the gods represent symbolically, but things. Discrete, countable, transferable things that exist in specific locations, can be picked up and moved, can be stored in containers, can be stolen, can be recovered, can be traded. The Sumerian scribes who wrote about the me describe them in ways that make no sense if the me are merely ideas. They are loaded onto a boat. They are carried through a harbor. They are unloaded in a city. You cannot do those things with a concept. The text called Inanna and Enki, which survives across multiple fragmentary copies that scholars including Thorkild Jacobson and Samuel Noah Kramer worked across decades to reconstruct into a coherent narrative, contains what is by far the most complete enumeration of me ever recorded in the cuneiform tradition. The list is extraordinary in its specificity. Reading it is not like reading a catalog of virtues. It is like reading an inventory. Kingship, godship, the exalted and enduring crown, the throne of kingship, the exalted scepter, the royal insignia, the exalted shrine, shepherdship, kingship, descent to the underworld, ascent from the underworld, the kurgara, the gala, the cult prostitute, the standard, the quiver, the art of the scribe, the craft of the smith, the craft of the leather worker, the craft of the builder, the craft of the basket weaver, wisdom, attentiveness, holiness, the purification ritual, the shepherd's crook, the descent of fire, the setting up of the lyre, the craft of the singer, the craft of the elder, the craft of the hero, the craft of the seer, the holy priestess, the carpenter's art, the metalworker's art, the scribe's art, the smith's art, the leatherworker's art, the mason's art, the basket weaver's art, the travel of roads, the descent to the underworld and ascent from the underworld, music, power, enmity, the destruction of cities, lamentation, rejoicing of the heart, the deceit, the rebel lands, goodness, justice, the beating of the drum, the descent of fire, the setting up of the reed flute, the holy song, the scribal art. The list goes on. The scholars who have assembled it count more than 100 distinct me in the Inanna and Enki text, though the fragmentary state of the tablet means some items may be lost and others may be partially reconstructed from context rather than direct reading. But even in its incomplete form, this list is remarkable for one reason above all others. It is not a list of divine powers that gods exercise over human beings. It is a list of the things human civilization is made of. Those craft skills, those political structures, those artistic traditions, those emotional capacities, those ritual practices, those technical arts. Every element on that list is something that a human society needs in order to function as a complex urban civilization rather than as a loose collection of subsistence farmers. Scribal art, smithcraft, architecture, organized mourning, political legitimacy, music, justice, the capacity for organized travel, the ability to descend to dangerous places and return, the technologies of smelting and building and weaving and organizing grain storage. The me, in other words, are not god powers. They are civilization powers. They are the technical and organizational and emotional infrastructure of complex society. And Enki kept them in the Abzu. This is the key fact. Not that the me existed, not that they were important, but that they were stored in Enki's domain, in the Abzu, the deep underwater realm that was Enki's exclusive territory. The other Anunnaki did not have access to the Abzu. Enlil did not have access to it. Anu did not have access to it. The me were in Enki's keeping, which means that the components of human civilization were controlled, individually and collectively, by the god who had designed the human template and who was now, in the divine assembly's framework, responsible for maintaining the human labor force at a level of capability appropriate to their designated function. The question that the Inanna and Enki text raises, the question that most introductory summaries never quite ask, is why? Why were the me in the Abzu? Why were they not distributed to the human cities already? The humans had been created. The irrigation work was being done. What was Enki waiting for? The text does not answer this directly, but the circumstances it describes suggest a working hypothesis. Enki was waiting for a moment when distributing the me could be justified, or at minimum explained, or if not explained, then accomplished in a way that could not be easily undone. The divine assembly presumably had opinions about what the human labor force should be capable of, and those opinions presumably did not include scribal art and architectural knowledge and political organizational capacity beyond what was needed to dig canals and tend grain. The me, in the assembly's likely view, were either not relevant to human beings or actively inappropriate for them. So, what does the text actually say happened? Inanna, the goddess of love and war, the great queen who ruled the city of Uruk, and who was one of the most vividly described personalities in the entire Sumerian divine corpus, comes to visit Enki in the Abzu. She comes to the Abzu of Eridu, the text says, and Enki calls to his minister Isimud and says, "Let the young woman step in. Let butter cake be given to her to eat. Let cold water be refreshed for her. Let her drink beer and wine before the Anunnaki." A feast. Enki is hosting Inanna in his underwater domain, and he is a generous host. The feast proceeds. The beer flows. The text, which is specific about these things in a way that feels deliberate, says that Enki was drinking beer, and the beer was very good, and his heart was full of joy. And in this state, expansive and generous and apparently not thinking through the consequences with his usual analytical precision, he begins offering Inanna gifts. He offers her the me, one at a time. He names each one and gives it to her. Kingship, godship, the holy priestess, the descent to the underworld, the scribe's art, and Inanna accepts each one. She accepts them all. More than 100, transferred at a divine feast, from the god who had been keeping them secure in the Abzu to the goddess who ruled the most important human city of the early Sumerian period. When the feast ends and Inanna departs on the boat of heaven with the me loaded aboard, and when Enki sobers up the next morning and asks his minister Isimud what happened to the me, the sequence that follows is the part that most popular treatments rush through. Enki sends Isimud and various supernatural creatures to intercept the boat of heaven at multiple points along its route. They try to recover the me at the harbor of Nippur, at the quay of Enki, at the Lex place of Sumer. Each time, Inanna refuses to give them back. She arrives at the white quay of Uruk and unloads all of the me into the city. The me are in a human city. They are no longer in the Abzu. They are no longer under Enki's control or the divine assembly's control. They are in Uruk, where the humans are. Now here is the question the ancient astronaut reading presses on with particular force. Enki is the god of wisdom. The tablets describe his intelligence throughout the corpus in terms that are unambiguous about its superiority to other divine beings. He is more subtle, more analytical, more capable of long-range strategic thinking than any other Anunnaki. He does not have accidents. Or if he does, his accidents consistently produce outcomes that benefit humanity in ways that his deliberate decisions could not have produced without drawing divine assembly attention. Was he drunk? Yes, the text says he was. Does he seem genuinely surprised when he discovers the me are gone? The text frames it that way. But how do you reconcile the God of wisdom, repeatedly described as essentially unable to make intellectual errors, with a scenario in which he gives away the most significant collection of civilization-enabling technologies in divine keeping at a party because the beer was very good? The ancient astronaut reading suggests you cannot reconcile it. What you can do is read the outcome as the intent. The me needed to reach a human city. They could not be officially distributed to human cities without divine assembly authorization that was unlikely to be forthcoming. They could not be publicly transferred by Enki without triggering exactly the kind of divine political conflict that would end with a vote to undo the transfer. But if Enki was drunk, and Inanna was persuasive, and the whole thing happened at a party in the Abzu where there were no other Anunnaki present to object in real time, and if the me arrived in Uruk before anyone could mount an organized response, and were then too distributed across the city to efficiently recover, the transfer accomplished what a formal distribution request would never have accomplished. The specific threat this addressed was the one that is hardest to see, because it involves a counterfactual. What human civilization would have looked like if the me had stayed in the Abzu? No scribal tradition means no writing. No writing means no accumulated knowledge, no cross-generational transmission, no science, no engineering specifications, no legal codes, no contracts, no agricultural data collected and refined across centuries. No architecture means no cities capable of coordinated collective action. No music means something about emotional and social integration that is harder to specify but that the Sumerian texts treat as essential to human cohesion. No political organizational structures means no capacity to respond collectively to threats. Every subsequent intervention on this list, including the ones that were far more urgent and far more explicit, would have been pointless if the humans who survived them were too cognitively and organizationally limited to rebuild anything. The flood survivor, with no scribal knowledge, has nowhere to put what he remembers. The city with no architectural tradition cannot build the infrastructure that makes urban density possible. The species without the me is a species that can survive individual crises but cannot accumulate survival across crises. Enki gave us the capacity to accumulate, and he did it in a way that the divine assembly could not cleanly reverse without sending armed divine forces to recover technology that had already been distributed across an entire city. Ninth place because the margin was wide. There was no immediate death vote, no extinction decree, just a pattern that would have, over time, kept humanity permanently manageable. Enki had room to work here, and he used that room carefully, and with what looked like a party. The next ones are less comfortable. 8. The creation of the 7 sages, and the knowledge network that should not have existed. The Apkallu. That is the Akkadian word. The Sumerian equivalent is Abgal, sometimes written Abgalu. The word itself carries interesting freight. Ab means father, or deep water. Gal means great. The compound means something in the range of great, one of the deep, or great wise one from the waters. 7 of them, in the canonical tradition. 7 beings that Enki created and sent into the antediluvian cities of Sumer before the flood. The visual tradition around the Apkallu, preserved across hundreds of Mesopotamian cylinder seals, wall reliefs, and stone carvings, shows them as figures combining human form with aquatic elements. Sometimes they are shown wearing fish skins draped across their shoulders and back, the head of the fish resting above their own heads like a hood or helmet. Sometimes they carry a bucket, called in the scholarly literature a bandudu, and a pine cone-like object, a mulilu, that they are in the process of applying to human figures or to sacred trees. The gesture appears across Mesopotamian art for over 2,000 years, and scholars have proposed numerous explanations for what it represents: purification, blessing, fertilization, the transmission of divine knowledge. The ancient astronaut reading takes a different approach. The fish garment, in this framework, is not a symbolic costume. It is a suit, a functional garment that allowed the Apkallu to operate in the underwater domain of the Abzu and on the surface simultaneously. The bucket contains something. The pinecone object applies something. The gesture of touching a human being or a tree with these implements is the gesture of direct knowledge or biological transmission, not symbolic blessing. What the texts say the Apkallu did is, in any framework, substantial. They are described in Berossus, the Babylonian priest and scholar who wrote a history of Mesopotamia in Greek in the 3rd century before the Common Era for the Library of Alexandria, as beings that lived among human beings before the Great Flood and who taught humanity the arts of civilization, agriculture, mathematics, medicine, the calendar, architecture, music, political organization. Berossus is explicit that before the appearance of the Apkallu, humanity lived in a disorganized state, and that after them the arts of civilization were established. He says that nothing of importance has been added since. That last claim is arresting. Nothing of importance has been added since. Berossus, writing in a period of considerable Greek scientific and philosophical achievement, looking back at a tradition that extended to before what he called the Great Flood, believed that the foundational knowledge structure of human civilization had been transmitted by these 7 beings before the flood, and that subsequent human intellectual achievement had been elaboration on that foundation rather than the addition of genuinely new categories. The Sumerian and Akkadian cuneiform texts support this in more fragmented ways. The text called the Era Epic, which describes a period of divine conflict and its consequences for civilization, refers to the Apkallu and their transmission to human communities in terms that treat this transmission as the original establishment of civilizational knowledge rather than one contribution among many. The wisdom texts of the Neo-Assyrian period, compiled under Ashurbanipal in the 7th century before the Common Era, and recovered from the ruins of Nineveh by Austin Henry Layard and Hormuzd Rassam in the 19th century, contain long lists of the sage traditions that the Apkallu established, organized by city. Each antediluvian city had its own Apkallu sage and its own tradition, which were then preserved in attenuated form through the post-diluvian sages, who were described as less pure, as mixed with human nature in ways the original seven were not, as carrying the tradition forward at reduced fidelity. Why does this count as an intervention rather than simply a divine educational program? Because the timing is everything. And the timing is the thing that most discussions of the Apkallu gloss over. The Atrahasis epic, which is the most complete surviving account of the flood narrative in Akkadian, makes it clear that the decision to send the flood was not made suddenly. It was the culmination of a process that included, before the flood, the 3 population reduction attempts we will discuss in Entry 7. Enlil tried to reduce the human population through drought and disease. Enlil tried through famine. Enlil tried through a more comprehensive agricultural destruction. 3 separate pre-flood reduction efforts, each of which failed for reasons we will examine. And throughout all 3 of those attempts, or at some point within that period, Enki was building the Apkallu program and sending the sages into the cities. This means Enki was building a knowledge transmission infrastructure at the same time that the Divine Assembly was actively trying to reduce the human population and was moving toward a final decision on extinction. He was not educating humanity because he expected the educational program to have a long time horizon. He was doing it because he was going to create a situation in which some humans survived the final extinction event, and he needed those survivors to carry enough transmitted knowledge that civilization could be reconstructed. The Apkallu program, in other words, was not just cultural enrichment, it was survival preparation disguised as cultural enrichment. Consider what the Apkallu actually transmitted, and why each element matters for post-catastrophe reconstruction. Agriculture. The specific techniques of irrigation-dependent cultivation in a semi-arid region, without which the Mesopotamian environment cannot support large human populations. Calendar. The astronomical and mathematical knowledge needed to coordinate agricultural cycles, which in a disrupted environment could mean the difference between a planting season successfully managed and one catastrophically mistimed. Architecture. The engineering principles of large-scale construction, without which post-flood communities cannot build the infrastructure needed for urban density and the specialized labor division urban density enables. Medicine. The accumulated pharmaceutical and surgical knowledge that determines survival rates in the immediate post-catastrophe period. Political organization. The institutional frameworks that allow groups of survivors to coordinate action rather than fragment into competitive bands. None of these things can be recovered quickly through independent discovery. Agriculture took, by the most conservative archaeological estimates, thousands of years to develop from scratch in regions where it emerged organically. The calendar requires astronomical observation across decades. Architecture requires accumulated engineering knowledge refined across many building attempts. Medicine requires empirical data about what works collected over generations of practitioners. If Enki sent the Apkallu into the cities specifically because he knew the flood was coming, and specifically because he wanted the transmitted knowledge to be carried by whoever survived, then the Apkallu program represents the most sophisticated pre-catastrophe survival planning in the ancient record. Not storing food or building boats. Building a knowledge network capable of reconstructing everything that a catastrophe could destroy. And the Apkallu operated out of the Abzu. This is explicit in the texts. They came from Enki's domain. They returned to it. They were his creatures, his program, operating under his direction. This was not a rogue initiative by well-meaning divine subordinates. This was Enki's investment in the future of a species that the Divine Assembly was simultaneously moving toward eliminating. The Divine Assembly, presumably including Enlil, presumably including the gods who would later take the Flood Oath, watched Enki build his knowledge network and did not stop it. Perhaps because it looked like ordinary divine administration of the human experiment. Perhaps because the May had already been distributed, and some educational program seemed like a natural follow-on. Perhaps because Enki's authority over the Abzu and over his own creatures gave him enough legitimate cover that intervention would have required an explicit divine assembly vote against what could be framed as internal management decisions. The margin at number 8 was wider than the events above it because the extinction decree was not yet finalized. Enki had institutional cover. He had time. He had the Abzu and his authority over it, but what he built here made every subsequent crisis survivable in a way it would not otherwise have been. Without the Apkallu's transmission, the flood survivor has nothing to rebuild with. Without the scribal tradition, the post-flood reconstruction does not produce, within the improbably compressed time frame, the king list records, the kind of urban civilization that appears at Kish, and then Uruk, and then across Sumer. The preparation was more important than it looked at the time. Most preparations for disaster are 7. The 3 times Enlil tried to reduce us and Enki found a way around each one. The Atrahasis epic is organized in a way that most modern readers find unexpected, around failure. Not dramatic failure, bureaucratic failure. Divine policy repeatedly implemented and repeatedly not achieving its intended effect. The experience of reading the pre-flood sections of the Atrahasis epic is something like reading the minutes of committee meetings where the agenda item is reduction of nuisance populations and the result is always that the nuisance population somehow survives. This is not accidental. The Atrahasis epic is the most complete narrative of the pre-flood period that survives in the cuneiform record, and its structural emphasis on 3 failed reductions before the flood itself appears to be making a deliberate point about the nature of divine authority and its limits. When there is a god in the assembly who does not share the assembly's objectives. Before we can understand the 3 reductions and Enki's role in circumventing each one, we need to understand the cause of the reductions, which the text specifies in terms that are deceptively simple. The Atrahasis text says the humans had become too numerous and too loud. The Akkadian word is rigmu. Every major translation of the Atrahasis epic has wrestled with rigmu because it is not a comfortable word. In straightforward Akkadian lexicography, it means noise, din, clamor, uproar. In the context of the Atrahasis epic, it appears to refer specifically to the noise that a large human population makes simply by existing. The physical, acoustic, material consequence of many bodies in a landscape, many animals being managed, many fires burning, many tools being used, many fields being worked. But several scholars, including the Assyriologist W.G. Lambert, who co-edited the definitive modern translation of the Atrahasis epic published in 1969, have noted that rigmu in context seems to carry a meaning that exceeds pure acoustic disturbance. The human population's rigmu disturbs Enlil's rest. It prevents him from sleeping. And while this is often treated as a somewhat comic divine complaint, the literal understanding of it, as Lambert and others have pointed out, seems to describe something more like the systemic environmental disturbance caused by a large and growing population altering its landscape, deforestation, soil depletion, water diversion, the kind of cumulative ecological pressure that a managed agricultural civilization exerts on its environment. Enlil's problem, in this reading, was not that the humans were too noisy in the acoustic sense. It was that the human population had grown beyond the parameters the original design intended, and that the exceeding of those parameters was producing downstream consequences that were affecting the divine management of the Mesopotamian environment. The humans were, in the language we would use, becoming an ecological problem at a scale that exceeded what the original Lulu project was supposed to produce. The first reduction Enlil implements is disease. The text specifies that Enlil causes plague, that a specific divine being called Namtar, associated with fate and with pestilence, is sent to implement the plague among the humans. Population drops, humans suffer. And then something happens that should not have been possible under a properly managed divine program. The humans successfully petition for relief. The mechanism of the petition is what matters. The text says that a human called Atrahasis, introduced here for the first time and described as exceedingly wise, with the specific qualifier indicating that his wisdom is recognized by divine beings as well as by humans, gathers the elders of his community and proposes a solution. He tells them not to pray to their personal gods in the normal way. Instead, he tells them to gather and make offerings specifically to Namtar, the being implementing the plague, and to cease all normal divine service to all other gods during the plague period. This is theologically strange. It is not the obvious response to a divine plague to stop worshipping all the gods who might help and focus exclusively on the god who is killing you. But it works. The text says that Namtar is moved by the offerings and the cessation of normal divine service, that Namtar lifts the plague, and that the human population recovers. Where did Atrahasis get this strategy? The text does not say, but the name Atrahasis is meaningful here. It means he who is exceedingly wise in Akkadian, and wisdom in the Sumerian and Akkadian literary tradition is consistently associated with Enki. When wisdom appears in the human sphere at a moment of crisis, and the wisdom takes a form that Enlil did not anticipate and cannot easily counteract, the implicit authorship of that wisdom in the textual tradition is Enki. Enlil responds to the failure of the first reduction with what the text describes as another meeting, another divine consultation, another expression of frustration that the program is not working. But the text does not show him identifying Enki as the source of the failure. He does not call a divine trial. He does not demand an accounting. he implements a second reduction. The second reduction is drought and famine. Adad, the storm god, is commanded to hold back the rain. Enbilulu, the canal inspector god, is commanded to withhold the floodwaters that the irrigation agriculture of Mesopotamia depends on. The text describes the consequences in specific terms. The black fields turn white, the broad plain is choked with salt, the womb of the earth does not bring forth, plants do not grow, the furrow is not prepared, the darkness of the fields does not yield grain. This is not a metaphor. This is the description of soil salinization from irrigation agriculture without sufficient flooding to leach the salt, combined with water shortage that prevents both flooding and direct rainfall agriculture. It is the specific environmental failure mode of Mesopotamian agriculture under climate stress. The text is describing something technically real. The human population begins to decline again. Not through disease this time, but through starvation. And again, the text shows the humans, through atrahasis, finding a way around the divine policy. This time, the intervention is more direct. The text describes Enki going to his son Nudimmud, and through Nudimmud acting to restore the sources of water and grain. The precise mechanism is not specified in the surviving text, but the consequence is the famine breaks, the drought ends, the agricultural system recovers. Enlil's reaction is now more explicit. He calls the divine assembly specifically to address the fact that the reductions are not working. He makes a speech in which he says, in terms that the tablets preserve despite significant lacunae, that someone has been undermining the divine program. He does not name Enki directly. The political dynamics of the Sumerian divine assembly seem to preclude that kind of direct accusation between major Anunnaki, but he makes it clear that the second reduction has been countered in ways that could not have happened without divine intervention on behalf of the humans. The assembly's response, preserved fragmentarily, appears to include an agreement to implement a more comprehensive third reduction, and to try to do so in a way that closes whatever loopholes were exploited in the first two. This time, the drought is total. The text describes multiple divine actors implementing multiple simultaneous restrictions, not just Adad withholding rain and Enbilulu withholding the canals, but the earth goddess refusing her fertility, the sea god restricting access to marine food sources, the divine management of the agricultural territory operating in coordinated opposition to human food production on every front simultaneously. This is the most comprehensive of the three reductions, and the one that comes closest to actually working. The text describes 7 years of famine. The descriptions are stark in the way that the best Mesopotamian literature is stark. Mothers and daughters sharing food, the strong eating the weak, the human population reduced to a fraction of what it had been. This was not a managed reduction to a target population level. This was approaching extinction. And Enki intervenes a third time, this time through a chain of divine intermediaries that insulates him from direct implication while still achieving the desired result. He acts through his son Ninagiku, through beings associated with the deep water, through the specific divine capabilities of the Abzu that other gods cannot access or replicate, and he arranges for specific human communities to receive the protection and resources that allow them to survive the third reduction. The third intervention is less clean than the first two. The text at this point is heavily damaged and reconstructed. What is clear is the outcome. The human population survives the third reduction. Not all of it, some of it, enough, and Enlil, faced with a third failure to achieve what should have been, by divine authority and divine power, a straightforward demographic reduction program, decides that the three partial methods are not going to work and that a total solution is required. The flood is proposed. The flood is voted on. The oath is sworn. This is the sequence. The three reductions are not separate incidents that happen to precede the flood. They are the explanation for why the flood had to be so comprehensive. Enlil needed total because Enki had successfully circumvented three programs that were less than total. The flood was the divine assembly's answer to Enki's pattern of interference, the answer being an event so complete and so rapidly implemented that there would be no time for Enki to route a technical workaround through agricultural divine bureaucracy. Just water. Everywhere. At once. Enki found a workaround anyway. We will get there. What ranks this intervention at 7 rather than higher is the margin. During all three reductions, the extinction of humanity was not yet policy. It was the direction of travel, and the three reductions made it increasingly certain that the direction was going that way. But at the time of each individual intervention, the divine assembly had not yet formally voted to end the human experiment. Enki was working in a space where divine policy was moving toward total extinction but had not yet arrived there. He had room, however diminishing, to push back without technically defying a binding divine assembly decree. The next items on this list are about what happens when that room runs out. 6. The night the Tablet of Destinies almost changed everything. To understand why this ranks at 6, you need to understand what the Tablet of Destinies actually is in the Sumerian and Akkadian cosmological system, because the popular descriptions of it as a divine record book or a divine scheduling document do not capture the specific nature of the authority it confers. The Tablet of Destinies is described in the texts as the mechanism by which binding divine decisions are made real, not the decisions themselves, the mechanism of their implementation. A god who holds the Tablet of Destinies does not just have authority in the sense of status or respect or voting weight in the divine assembly. A god who holds the Tablet of Destinies has the power to issue decrees that become materially operative. The decree is not just a statement of intention, it is a causal mechanism. The texts that describe the tablet's function treat it as the literal instrument by which the gods will operate on physical reality. When a god issues a decree and the decree is backed by the Tablet of Destinies, what the text says happens is not that the decree is then implemented through various divine agents carrying out instructions. What happens is that the decree is true. The tablet makes the statement of fate into fate itself. This is a cosmological claim that does not have a clean modern equivalent. But the closest analogy might be to imagine that someone's ability to write on a specific document was not just the ability to make authoritative statements, but the actual causal link between intention and physical reality. The Tablet of Destinies is the interface between divine will and material consequence. Enlil holds it. He is supposed to hold it. And for the most of the Sumerian textual period, the arrangement is stable. Enlil has the tablet. Enlil issues decrees. The decrees become fate. The divine assembly and humanity operate within the fate Enlil has decreed. This is the cosmos as the Sumerians understood it. The myth of Anzu describes what happens when that arrangement is disrupted. Anzu is a divine being who is difficult to categorize using the standard Sumerian divine hierarchy. He is sometimes described as a lion-headed eagle of enormous size, sometimes associated with storms and wind and mountain regions, sometimes depicted in a form that is more humanoid. The name Anzu is typically translated as something in the range of Heaven's Storm or Lord of the Sky Storm, and the texts associate him with the liminal spaces between the divine and human worlds, with mountains and remote regions, with a kind of wild divine power that does not fit neatly into the organized divine bureaucracy of Sumer. Anzu serves as a doorkeeper of the divine assembly. He has direct access to divine spaces. And one morning, while Enlil is performing his morning ablutions, while Enlil's crown is set aside and the divine regalia are temporarily not actively being worn, Anzu sees the Tablet of Destinies lying within reach and takes it. The specific detail of the morning ablution is significant in ways that the tablets seem to understand they are being significant about. It is a moment of deliberate inattention, deliberate vulnerability, a moment when the mechanisms of divine authority are temporarily suspended because the god who holds them is performing a domestic ritual. Anzu chooses that moment, not the assembly. Not a moment of divine conflict or distraction by major events. The face-washing moment, the moment when even supreme divine authority is briefly set aside. Anzu flies to the mountains with the tablet. And the consequences, as described in the text, are immediate and described in terms that the tablets treat as cosmically serious. The tablet being absent from Enlil means the divine orders cease to function. The text says, divine rites were suspended, the gods did not perform their offices, the pure rituals were interrupted. The food offerings for the gods stopped. The tablet describes a kind of cosmic administrative shutdown. Why does this concern humanity? Because the period when Anzu holds the Tablet of Destinies is a period when the decree-making mechanism that governs human existence is in the hands of an unknown quantity. The divine assembly's decrees about the human experiment, whatever they were at this point in the narrative timeline, are now subject to modification or nullification by Anzu. And Anzu, who took the tablet in what the text frames as an act of self-aggrandizement, who uses the tablet to make himself invulnerable to divine attack, shows no sign of having a coherent policy toward the human species either way. A being who holds the power to issue binding fate decrees and who has no particular stake in human continuation is in principle more dangerous to human survival than a being who actively wants to reduce the human population, but who operates within a divine assembly framework where competing interests create a kind of protection through political complexity. Enlil, for all his hostility toward human noise, is constrained by the divine assembly, by Enki's presence in that assembly, by the various competing divine interests that make the assembly a space where Enki can argue and negotiate and find loopholes. Anzu with the tablet is not constrained by any of this. He is operating outside the divine assembly structure. His decrees do not need assembly ratification. If he issues a fate decree regarding humanity, it becomes fate. The divine assembly's response to Anzu's theft is, by the tablet's account, a kind of paralysis punctuated by individual gods volunteering to fight Anzu and then declining when the problem with fighting Anzu is explained. Anu calls on Adad to go fight. Adad declines. Enlil calls on various divine warriors. They decline. The problem is the tablet. Whatever weapon a god sends against Anzu, Anzu can use the tablet to decree that weapon back to its constituent components: arrow to wood and feather, net to fiber, club to wood. The tablet makes his counter-defense operationally perfect because his defense is not physical but ontological. He does not deflect weapons. He decrees them not to be weapons. Enki does not volunteer to fight Anzu either. What Enki does, and the text is explicit about this, is produce the solution. Ninurta, Enlil's son, and the divine warrior who will ultimately confront and defeat Anzu, goes to Enki for counsel before the battle. Enki tells Ninurta something about the tablet's mechanism, about how it operates, about what it can and cannot do, that allows Ninurta to design a confrontation strategy that circumvents the tablet's perfect defensive capacity. The strategy itself is not perfectly preserved in the surviving text. The tablets at the relevant point have gaps. But the outcome is clear. Ninurta goes to the mountain, confronts Anzu, defeats him, and recovers the Tablet of Destinies, which is then returned to Enlil. The specific content of Enki's advice is the most interesting unknown in this narrative. What did Enki know about the tablet's operation that no other god knew? The text implies that Enki's understanding of the mechanism by which the tablet's decrees function was more detailed and more technical than anyone else's. This is consistent with his role throughout the Sumerian corpus as the god of practical wisdom, of technical knowledge, of engineering-level understanding of how things work rather than merely the authority to use them. Enki knew something about the tablet, something that allowed him to identify a gap in the tablet's seemingly perfect defensive capability. And he gave that knowledge to Ninurta, which means he chose to restore the tablet to Enlil rather than to allow a situation to persist in which divine authority was held by an unpredictable external actor. This is the choice that makes this intervention interesting from the human survival perspective. Enlil with the tablet is bad for humanity in the long run. Enlil is the god who will eventually decree the flood and who spent the pre-flood period trying to reduce the human population. Returning the tablet to him does not create a friendly situation for human beings. But Anzu with the tablet is potentially catastrophic in a way that Enlil's tablet-backed hostility is not. Because Anzu's hostility, or indifference, or whatever his policy toward humanity would have been expressed through decrees that became fate without going through the divine assembly process that gave Enki his operating space. The assembly is where Enki can argue. The assembly is where competing interests produce compromise and where oaths have specific language that can be parsed for loopholes. A divine authority structure where the tablet is held by a being who does not participate in the assembly is a structure where Enki has no leverage at all. He chose the structure he could work within. He restored the status quo that was hostile but navigable over the alternative that was unpredictable and potentially unnavigable. And he did it by providing the knowledge that made Ninurta's victory possible. Knowledge that the text implies only Enki possessed. The margin at number 6 was the duration of Anzu's hold on the tablet and the specific direction of any fate decrees he might have issued. He did not appear to issue decrees against humanity during the period he held the tablet, but the potential was present, and the absence of assembly constraints meant there was nothing to prevent it. Enki acted to restore the constraining structure before the potential became actual. 5. The Adapa incident and the immortality that Enki chose not to give. The Adapa myth is one of the genuinely strange texts of the ancient Near East. Not strange in the way that many creation myths are strange, where the strangeness comes from cosmological assumptions that differ from modern ones. Strange in the way that a story is strange when something happened in it that the storytellers clearly wanted to preserve but were not entirely sure how to categorize. Strange in the way of a story that is doing several things simultaneously, and where the surface narrative and the deeper narrative are moving in different directions. The text survives primarily in fragments recovered from the library of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh, the same library that preserved the flood narrative, the Atrahasis epic, and the Gilgamesh tablets. Additional fragments came from the Amarna archive in Egypt, which was the diplomatic correspondence archive of the pharaoh Amenhotep IV, known as Akhenaten, and which dates to the 14th century before the Common Era. The Amarna fragments of the Adapa myth are significant because they suggest the text was considered important enough to be kept in an Egyptian royal archive, which implies it was being circulated across the Near East as something of general significance rather than as local Mesopotamian tradition. Adapa is a human, but he is not an ordinary one. The text describes him in terms that immediately separate him from the Lulu as a category. He is called the model of men, the perfect formula, the holy scribe. He is said to have been given wisdom by Enki specifically, a wisdom that is described in terms of knowing the words of the gods and understanding the designs of heaven and earth. He performs sacred rituals. He fishes in the sea off the coast of Eridu, which is described as a priestly duty rather than ordinary labor. He is, in the ancient astronaut reading, something close to a prototype, a human being given an exceptional cognitive configuration by Enki for purposes that the standard Lulu design did not require. The critical sequence begins on a day when Adapa is out on the sea in a small boat performing his fishing duties and the south wind overturns him. The south wind, Shutu in Akkadian, is a divine entity or is controlled by a divine entity. The text treats the south wind as a being with will and intention, not a meteorological phenomenon. The south wind acts against Adapa deliberately. Adapa responds by breaking the wing of the south wind. This is not metaphorical. Whatever Adapa does, whether it is a word of power, a technical application of knowledge, Enki gave him a physical act against a divine entity in a form he could interact with. The result is that the south wind cannot blow for 7 days. The absence of the south wind is noticed by Anu, the high god, the father of the gods, the sky god who sits above even Enlil and Enki in the divine hierarchy. Anu notices the absence and summons the gatekeeper Ilibrat to explain it. Ilibrat explains that Adapa broke the south wind's wing. Anu summons Adapa to heaven, a human before Anu, not before the divine assembly as a whole, before the highest god in the pantheon. This is not something the texts describe happening at any other point in the Sumerian or Akkadian record. Humans do not appear before Anu. Humans pray through their personal gods to the lesser divine tier, occasionally accessing Enlil or Enki through the chain of divine intercession. They do not go to Anu. Enki prepares Adapa for the audience. This is the part the text spends considerable time on. Enki tells Adapa exactly how to present himself. Wear mourning garments. Do not comb your hair. Let your appearance suggest grief and submission. When you arrive at the gate of Anu, you will encounter Dumuzi and Ningishita, 2 divine beings who are associated with the gateway between worlds. Bow to them, praise them, because they will ask Anu to treat you with mercy. And then, when Anu offers you food, and he will offer you food, do not eat it. Do not eat what you are offered. Do not drink what you are offered. Do not take the oil. Do not put on the garment. This is explicit. Enki tells Adapa, Anu is going to offer you something. Refuse it. The food he offers is the bread of death and the water of death. Adapa does exactly what Enki tells him. He wears mourning clothes. He goes to heaven. He encounters Dumuzi and Ningishita at the gate, and they do indeed intercede for him, asking Anu why this human is here looking so bereaved. Adapa explains that he was doing his priestly duties, and the south wind overturned him, and he broke its wing. The divine gatekeepers find this sympathetic. They speak well of him to Anu. Anu looks at Adapa and finds him impressive, or is moved by the intercession of the gate gods, or makes some calculation about this particular human that the text suggests but does not specify. And Anu offers Adapa the bread of life and the water of life. These are not the bread of death and the water of death that Enki said they were. They are the opposite. They are the divine food substances that confer immortality, the specific material by which gods maintain their eternal existence. Anu is offering Adapa a place among the gods. Adapa declines, because Enki told him to. He refuses the bread. He refuses the water. He refuses the oil and the garment. He accepts only a garment offered for the return journey. And then he is sent back to earth. The divine reaction in the text is interesting. Anu, when Adapa refuses, asks, "Why would you do this, Adapa? Why would you refuse?" And the text records Adapa explaining that his master Enki told him not to eat or drink. Anu's response in the text is something between amazement and a kind of cosmic irony. He says, essentially, that is the reason you are mortal. You were offered the way to become immortal, and your own creator told you to refuse it. The scholarly debate about why Enki did this has produced several competing interpretations. The traditional mythological reading treats it as a meditation on the human condition. Mortality was always going to be humanity's lot, and the story explains why even a chance at immortality does not result in immortal humans. The psychological reading treats it as a story about the dangers of trusting authority figures who do not share your interests. The ancient astronaut reading takes a different angle. In the ancient astronaut framework, Enki's deception of Adapa is not a story about mortality as a cosmic condition. It is a story about a specific strategic choice that Enki made at a specific moment regarding the boundary between human and divine. If Adapa had eaten the bread and drunk the water, he would have become immortal. He would have become, in the divine categorization of the Sumerian texts, something that was no longer categorically human. He would have been in Anu's court, at Anu's level, operating at divine timescales. This would have been unprecedented. The human experiment was supposed to produce Lulu, workers. The divine assembly did not authorize an immortal human in the divine court. There was no framework for it. There was no category for it. What would an immortal human in the divine court have meant for the human species as a whole? This is where the interpretations diverge, and where the ancient astronaut reading makes its most interesting claim. A human who had crossed the divine threshold through the consumption of divine food was not just an individual who had become personally immortal, he was a proof of concept. He was evidence that the human-divine boundary was permeable in a specific direction through a specific mechanism. If Adapa returned from Anu's court immortal, if it became known that the food of the gods conferred immortality on human beings who consumed it, the implications for the divine management of the human experiment were severe. Every human who could access divine food, or whose personal god could petition for divine food on their behalf, or who could find some other way to access the mechanism that Adapa had demonstrated, was a potential candidate for divine status. The Lulu was supposed to be categorically separate from the Anunnaki. The divine food demonstrated that this categorical separation was not biological destiny but management policy. Enki, by telling Adapa to refuse, prevented this demonstration. He preserved the categorical boundary between human and divine. He prevented a situation that would have triggered immediate divine assembly action and that might have produced a decree, backed by Anu's authority and the Tablet of Destinies, regarding humanity's permissible access to divine spaces and divine substances. A decree of that nature, issued by Anu rather than Enlil, would have been of a different order of permanence than Enlil's various management decisions. He also, and this is the intervention element that justifies this ranking, kept Adapa alive. The text does not say what would have happened if Adapa had accepted the bread and water and become immortal in Anu's court. But the Divine Assembly's record regarding unprecedented human behavior, the Rigmu problem, the three reductions, the eventual flood, suggests that the Assembly's default response to humans exceeding their categorical parameters was to reduce the problem. An immortal human in the divine court was a problem that the Divine Assembly had no existing framework for managing. Anu's offer may have been genuine, or it may have been a test. Either way, Enki's instruction to refuse kept Adapa in a category the Assembly knew how to deal with, which meant Adapa went home. The margin at number 5 was the specific nature of Anu's offer, and the specific nature of what accepting it might have precipitated. This is one of the more ambiguous interventions on the list because it is not clear that Enki was protecting humanity in the way we normally think of protection. He was protecting a boundary, a categorization, a managed relationship between human and divine that gave him space to continue operating on humanity's behalf. He sacrificed Adapa's personal immortality in order to preserve the conditions under which the human experiment could continue. That is cold calculation. The texts do not shy away from it. 4. The post-flood reconstruction that was not supposed to happen so fast. The Sumerian king list is one of the most analyzed and most debated documents in the entire corpus of ancient Near Eastern scholarship. It is a tablet, preserved in multiple copies across several time periods, that lists the kings of Sumer from the beginning of kingship, which the text places before the flood, through the historical dynasties of the early dynastic period and beyond. The kings are named, their cities are named, their reigns are given in years. And in the pre-flood section, those years are spectacularly, implausibly large. Alulim of Eridu reigned for 28,800 years. Alangar, also of Eridu, reigned for 36,000 years. The antediluvian total, across 8 kings of 5 cities, is 241,200 years before the flood came and, as the king list says, kingship was again lowered from heaven. These numbers are the thing that causes most mainstream historical scholarship to treat the king list as mythology rather than history. No human king lived 28,000 years. The argument stops there for most purposes. But a growing number of researchers and scholars, including those working within the ancient astronaut framework and those working within more conventional comparative mythology and linguistics, have noted that dismissing the king list's numbers does not resolve the interesting structural feature that persists even when the numbers are set aside. The structural feature is this. After the flood, kingship is restored to specific cities, and the trajectory from post-flood restoration of kingship to the historical early dynastic period, which archaeology can trace materially and which is therefore anchored in objective chronology, is dramatically shorter than models of independent cultural reconstruction from scratch would predict. Eridu, the first post-flood city in the king list, is also one of the oldest archaeologically confirmed sites in Mesopotamia. The Eridu material culture layers, worked extensively by the Iraqi Department of Antiquities and by British archaeologists in the mid-20th century, show a continuous occupation history that begins in the Ubaid period, roughly around the 6th millennium before the Common Era, and continues through the Sumerian dynastic periods. This continuity is real. It is in the ground. But the rate of cultural and organizational complexity increase that the archaeological record shows after the post-flood disruption horizon is striking. Whatever the flood event actually was, and there are multiple competing geological and archaeological hypotheses about what Mesopotamian catastrophic event the flood narratives might be encoding, the period after it shows a recovery of urban complexity that is faster than independent reconstruction models predict. This is where Enki's fourth intervention appears. Not as a single dramatic event like the Anzu theft or the Adapa incident, but as a sustained program of post-catastrophe reconstruction that the texts describe in ways that are consistent with deliberate divine administration, rather than natural cultural recovery. The Eridu Genesis text, which Thorkild Jacobsen worked across decades to reconstruct, and which he considered one of the most important texts for understanding Sumerian cosmological thinking, describes the re-establishment of civilization after the flood in terms that emphasize specific divine decisions about which cities receive which gifts. Kingship is given to Kish. The city of Kish is given specific attributes. Then kingship passes to Uruk, and Uruk is given different but equally specific attributes. The distribution of post-flood civilization is described as a deliberate act of divine allocation rather than as the organic recovery of scattered human communities. Enki's fingerprints in this process are visible primarily through the institutions that reappear in the post-flood cities in the texts. The scribal tradition, the Adaba, the tablet house, the school for scribes, appears in the earliest post-flood urban contexts in ways that presuppose a continuous tradition rather than an independently invented one. The astronomical calendar, the post-flood Sumerian calendar, shows a level of astronomical precision that requires accumulated observational data across many generations, data that cannot have been independently accumulated in the brief period between the flood and the earliest datable astronomical observations in the Sumerian record. The hydraulic engineering of the post-flood irrigation systems shows the same feature, a technical sophistication that implies accumulated knowledge rather than rediscovered principles. You do not independently rediscover the engineering principles of large-scale irrigation canal systems in a generation or two. You inherit them, and the texts suggest, consistently, that the inheritance happened through the Apkallu tradition, through the post-flood sages who were the successors of Enki's pre-flood knowledge network, operating in the post-flood cities and transmitting what the flood was supposed to have erased. This is the intervention. Enki overseeing the reconstruction of civilizational knowledge in the post-flood period through mechanisms that ensured the flood's intended cultural erasure did not fully occur. The divine assembly presumably intended the flood to reset the human experiment, to produce a smaller, simpler, more manageable human population starting from a much lower knowledge base. What they got instead was a human population that, within a historically improbable time frame, had reconstructed the scribal tradition, the astronomical calendar, the agricultural engineering, the political organizational frameworks, and the urban density that the flood was supposed to have erased. Enki managed this reconstruction. The texts show him doing it through the Apkallu successors, through the divine allocation of civilization markers to specific cities, through his continuing role as the patron deity of Eridu, which was both the first post-flood city in the king list and the city most associated in the Sumerian tradition with Enki's direct presence and involvement. The divine assembly either did not notice, or did not have a clear basis for objection, or was satisfied with the reduced human population count, regardless of the speed of cultural recovery. The post-flood world had fewer people. Maybe that was enough. Maybe Enlil's objection had always been more about numbers than about complexity, and a complex civilization of reduced population was, from his perspective, within acceptable parameters. Or maybe Enki moved faster than the assembly could react, and by the time the post-flood reconstruction had reached the level where it would have been obvious that the flood's cultural reset had been undone, too much had been rebuilt to justify a second flood. The margin at number 4 was the completeness of the flood's cultural erasure. If it had been total, the reconstruction would have been impossible regardless of Enki's intentions. The flood came close enough to total that the reconstruction required sustained divine effort over what the texts suggest was a considerable period. That sustained effort, invisible in the individual texts but visible as a pattern across the post-flood corpus, is Enki's fourth intervention. 3. The night Enki spoke to a wall. The Atrahasis epic returns here at its most famous and most precisely analyzed moment, and it is precisely analyzed because the specific mechanism of what Enki does is so extraordinary that it has drawn scholarly attention for as long as the text has been available for study. The divine assembly convenes. Enlil makes the case for the flood. The magnitude of the accumulated failures of the 3 population reduction attempts, the continuing growth of the human population, the ongoing rigmu, all of it has led to the conclusion that partial measures will not achieve what is needed and that a comprehensive solution is required. A flood. Not a localized flood, not a river flood that affects one region, but something described in the texts in terms that suggest totality. A flood that covers everything, that does not distinguish between city and countryside, that ends the human noise by ending the humans. The great gods ratify the decision. This is collective. The Atrahasis epic is explicit that the flood is not Enlil's unilateral decision, it is a divine assembly decree. The assembled Anunnaki, Anu included, agree to the flood. And then they do something that is, in the context of a divine assembly making a collective decision, significant. They swear an oath. Not just agree, swear. The oath is binding in the Sumerian cosmological framework in a way that divine assembly decisions without oath confirmation are not. An oath by the Anunnaki, an oath by Anu and Enlil, is described in the texts as the highest possible category of binding commitment. It cannot be reversed by the party who swore it. It cannot be overridden by subsequent assembly discussion. It cannot be technically voided by a later vote. It is, in the cosmological framework, the texts operate within. Final. Before we move on to the flood, stop for a second. What you just heard about Adapa only makes sense on the full timeline, next to the 6 resets before it. Every version ended the same way. It is all in the 7 resets, linked below. Grab it, come back. QR code is on your screen. Enki is in the assembly. Enki hears the oath formulated, and the oath as formulated contains specific language. The gods swear that they will not reveal the secret of the great gods to any human being. The word that matters, the word that the ancient astronaut reading of this text always eventually arrives at because it is doing so much work in such a small space, is the word that means human being. The oath is against revealing the flood to a human being. Enki swears this oath. Then he goes to a wall. The text is specific in a way that feels deliberate about what Enki does next. He does not find Atrahasis directly. He does not appear to Atrahasis in a dream himself. He does not send a divine messenger. He goes to the wall of a reed house, and he speaks to the wall. The wall is instructed to listen. The wall is addressed as if it has the capacity to understand and act on what it is being told. And Enki tells the wall what he cannot tell a human being, that the flood is coming, that the divine assembly has decreed it, that the oath has been sworn. And then he tells the wall what needs to be done. A boat, specific dimensions, specific construction materials and sealing methods, a specific roster of what to bring aboard, animals, craftspeople, seeds, the knowledge needed to rebuild. Atrahasis, the exceedingly wise one, is behind the wall. He hears everything. The text confirms this. He calls through the wall to ask if Enki is speaking to him, and Enki confirms, while being very careful about the language he uses, that Atrahasis has understood correctly what he needs to do and should do it. The precision of the loophole is the thing that commentators across the centuries have returned to, and the reason it is so consistently noted is that it is not an obvious loophole. It is a subtle one. The oath said the gods could not reveal the secret to a human being. Enki did not reveal it to a human being. He revealed it to a wall. The wall is not a human being. The wall does not have the category status that the oath was drafted to protect against. Enki spoke to a wall. That the wall was adjacent to a human being who was listening, and that the human being understood and acted on what he heard, and that this was the obvious and anticipated result of speaking to that particular wall in that particular location, is not something the oath's language was able to prohibit. The oath was swearing about revelation to human beings. Enki found the gap between the oath's language and the oath's intent, and he threaded Atrahasis through it. The sophistication of this move is not accidental. The god of wisdom, the god who had been present when the oath was formulated, who had heard the exact language of the prohibition, who understood the cosmological binding power of oaths in the Sumerian framework well enough to know that he could not simply ignore or override it, found the exact construction that allowed him to technically satisfy the oath's language while achieving the result the oath was designed to prevent. This is the action of a being who had thought about the oath's language carefully, probably while the oath was still being formulated, probably while Enlil was still making the case for the flood in the assembly. The loophole worked because Enki knew the loophole was there before the oath was sworn. He did not discover it afterward in a moment of desperation. He was looking for it from the moment the flood decision was being discussed. This ranks at number 3 because the scale is what the scale is. The divine assembly had decreed the extinction of the human species through a comprehensive flood, and Enki's response produced a single surviving human and his family. One family, one boat, everything that humanity would become afterward. Every king in the post-flood king list. Every city, every scribal tradition, every piece of clay with text on it that survived to this day, descended from the occupants of that boat. The margin was one family. The mechanism was a wall. But what ranks this third rather than second is that Enki had the wall conversation before the flood arrived. He had time to plan. He had time to identify the loophole and use it. The crisis was extreme, but the execution was methodical. He had the space, however narrow, to apply his intelligence to the problem before the problem reached its most acute stage. What comes at number 2 is what happened after the flood, when the space was gone entirely. 2. The moment on the mountain, when Enlil came to finish what the flood had started. The flood is over. The waters have receded. The boat rests on a mountain, and the survivor, who in the later Akkadian Gilgamesh version is called Utnapishtim, and who in the earlier Atrahasis version is Atrahasis, opens the hatch and steps out onto the mountain and makes offerings. A fire. Burnt offerings to the gods. The first act of the surviving human is a religious one, a re-establishment of the relationship between humanity and the divine hierarchy that the flood was supposed to have permanently ended. The offering smoke rises. And the Atrahasis epic at this point uses imagery that has struck everyone who has worked with this text as remarkable. The gods crowded over the offering like flies, because the food supply had not been seen for so long. They had gone without their offerings for the duration of the flood. They were hungry. They were drawn to the smoke. This detail about the gods needing the offerings, being drawn to them as flies are drawn to food, is almost certainly not accidental in a text that is otherwise quite careful about how it presents the divine characters. The gods need what humans provide. The flood was not just bad for humans, it was bad for the gods too. The divine ecosystem that the Sumerian texts describe, in which the gods are sustained in part by the offerings of human worshippers, is a system in which the extinction of humanity would have consequences for the gods that the gods themselves had apparently not fully calculated before voting for the flood. Enlil arrives. He sees the survivor. And the text's description of his reaction is not ambiguous. He is not neutral. He is not processing the information calmly. He is angry. The word the text uses describes rage, fury, the kind of divine emotional state that in the Sumerian textual tradition precedes action. And the action Enlil is contemplating is visible in the question he asks the assembled gods. He turns to them and says, "How did a living being escape?" Not, "I see there was a survivor. Let us discuss what to do with him." Not, "It appears the flood was not entirely effective. Let us review." He says, "How did a living being escape?" The question is an accusation. He is looking for who is responsible. He is building toward a response to whoever he identifies as responsible. And the survivor is standing right there. The survivor's continued existence is, at this moment, contingent on what happens in the next minutes. Enlil is not a god who makes measured decisions when he is in the state the text describes. He wanted extinction. He got a survivor. The political calculation of the moment, from the perspective of any god who cared about that survivor's existence, required an intervention that was not technical and not deniable and not routed through a wall or a chain of divine intermediaries. It required an argument, in real time, with Enlil in rage and the survivor visible and the other gods watching. Enki intervenes. He steps forward. What he says is preserved in the tablets, imperfectly because the clay has gaps, but the core of the argument is recoverable, and it is an extraordinary piece of divine rhetoric. The argument has 2 parts. The first part is a counterattack. Enki does not defend himself. He accuses Enlil. He says, "You who are sage of the gods, how could you, without deliberation, bring about a flood?" This is a direct challenge to Enlil's decision-making process, not to the flood's validity as a policy, but to the way the policy was implemented. Without deliberation is doing a lot of work in that phrase. It implies that Enlil made a hasty, unthought-through decision rather than the carefully considered divine assembly decree that the Atrahasis epic just spent considerable time establishing. Enki is reframing the flood as impulsive rather than authoritative. Then Enki makes a moral argument. On the sinner impose his sin, on the transgressor impose his transgression. He is saying that collective punishment of all humanity for the transgressions of some humans is unjust by the divine assembly's own standards of divine justice. This is an appeal to principle that operates independently of whether Enki violated the oath, because it is about what Enlil did rather than about what Enki did. Enlil punished the innocent along with the guilty. This is a standard of injustice that the Sumerian divine tradition recognized. Then Enki delivers the alternative narrative. He did not reveal the secret of the great gods, he says. The survivor had a dream. A wise man, full of wisdom, perceived the divine plan and passed it on to Atrahasis himself. This is the narrative that cleanly exonerates Enki while providing an explanation for how the survivor knew what he knew. It was not Enki. It was the survivor's own wisdom, receiving divine inspiration through the mechanism of dreams, which were acknowledged in the Sumerian cosmological framework as a legitimate channel of divine communication. There is no evidence that any of the gods in the assembly found this explanation entirely convincing. But the text records that after Enki's speech, what happens is not a second flood. What happens is that Enlil approaches the survivor and his wife. He touches their foreheads. He blesses them. And he grants them a status that the text describes as divine. They will live like gods, at the mouth of the rivers, far from normal human habitation. The survivor becomes, by Enlil's own action, something that neither fits the category of ordinary human, nor poses the kind of ongoing threat to divine management that an ordinary surviving human might. Enlil solved the problem of the survivor's existence by elevating it to a different category, one that removed it from the human experimental framework entirely. This required Enki to have changed Enlil's operational stance in real time, in a confrontation where Enlil arrived with the intention of addressing the survival, where the tools available to Enlil at that moment included the authority of the divine assembly decree and the power to do what the flood had not finished, and where the only thing that prevented that from happening was an argument made under pressure. The margin at number 2 was the argument's quality and Enlil's receptivity to it in the moment. That is not a structural margin. That is a personality-dependent, in the moment, everything could go differently margin. Enki had no wall to speak through. He had no loophole to exploit. He had Enlil in front of him, and the survivor visible, and the gods watching, and he made an argument. And the argument worked. Everything below this point was preparation. Everything at this point was execution under fire. And what comes at number 1 is what made even this execution possible. 1. The moment before the oath, when Enki heard the exact language. This is the intervention that is hardest to see because it is not an action, it is a presence. It is being in the room. It is hearing the specific words of a specific oath formulated in a specific way at a specific moment, and understanding in that moment what the words make possible rather than what the words prohibit. The divine assembly voted on the flood. We know Enki was there because he swore the oath that was taken afterward. An oath about a decision requires presence at the decision. He was in the room. He heard Enlil make the case. He heard the great gods ratify it. He heard the oath formulated and swore it alongside the others. The Atrahasis epic does not preserve what Enki said in the assembly during the discussion that led to the flood decree. We have no record of whether he argued against the flood, whether he questioned its scope, whether he pointed out the divine food supply consequences that the gods apparently had not calculated. The text at the pre-oath assembly section is either not preserved or was not written down as part of the narrative, or the events of that meeting were considered less relevant to record than the oath and its aftermath. What we have is the oath. And what the oath reveals, in the reading that takes the wall conversation seriously, is everything we need to understand about what the moment before the oath actually was. The oath's specific language was the thing that made the wall conversation possible. The gods swore not to reveal the secret to any human being, not to any living being, not in any form, not through any mechanism, not to any human being. That specific limitation, that specific categorical restriction that named the prohibited recipient rather than prohibiting all forms of transmission, is the gap that Enki's wall conversation threaded through. For the wall conversation to work, the oath had to be worded the way it was worded. If the oath had said the gods would not reveal the secret through any means, if the oath had said the gods would not communicate the information about the flood to any entity capable of communicating it to a human being, the wall conversation would not have worked. The reed wall cannot receive a divine message and transmit it to a human without constituting a communication chain that any oath with appropriately broad language would have prohibited. But the oath said human beings, and the wall is not a human being. Either Enlil drafted the oath with that specific language because it was the natural way to express the prohibition, and he did not think carefully enough about what was technically not a human being, or someone in the assembly process ensured that the oath's language remained narrow enough to contain the gap. The text does not give us the deliberation leading to the oath's formulation. We do not know whether Enki suggested specific language, or whether the language was proposed by Enlil and Enki simply noticed the gap in it without saying anything. What we know is that by the time the oath was sworn, Enki had what he needed. The specific wording of the prohibition told him exactly how to circumvent it. A wall is not a human being. The prohibition was against human beings. He would speak to a wall. This required being in the room when the oath was formulated. This required hearing the exact language as it was being stated. This required the analytical capacity to parse the language in real time and identify the gap before the oath was finalized and sworn, because after the oath was sworn, the gap was the only way through and there was no time to search for another one. If Enki had not been in the assembly, or if he had been in the assembly but had not attended closely to the exact language of the oath, or if the oath had been formulated and transmitted to him afterward rather than sworn in his presence, the wall conversation would not have happened. The specificity of the loophole depended on the specificity of the oath's language, and the specificity of the oath's language was only available to someone who was there when it was formulated. The closest call of all is the moment when a god who had spent an enormous period of time working to ensure human survival sat in an assembly that was voting to end human survival, heard the exact words of the prohibition against warning human beings, and in that moment of hearing identified the reed wall and the conversation through it, and the entire chain of events that would produce a survivor and a boat and a mountain and an argument under pressure that would keep that survivor alive long enough for human civilization to rebuild from. Him. All 9 interventions looking back from here were building toward this moment. The May in Uruk, humans with the capacity to use the knowledge a flood survivor carries. The Apkallu, the specific knowledge the survivor needed to carry. The 3 reductions, the reasons the assembly moved from partial to total. The Anzu crisis, the restoration of the assembly framework within which the oath could be sworn in enforceable and parsable language. The Adapa incident, the maintenance of the boundary that kept the divine food supply issue intact as a diplomatic lever for Enki's post-flood argument. The post-flood reconstruction, the use of the survivors' descendants to rebuild what the flood erased. All of it points back to a moment in an assembly meeting that we do not have on record, a moment where a god heard specific words and understood what those words made possible. 9 times Enki saved humanity. From the bottom of the list, where the margin was wide and the tools were available and the deniability was easy to maintain, to the top, where the margin was the difference between hearing specific language and not hearing it, between being in the room and not being in the room. Everything human beings have built since then, every word written on every surface, every city raised above every floodplain, every calculation made about every cycle of stars, every dynasty that rose and fell and left its records in the clay, descended from the gap between what a divine oath prohibited and what it forgot to prohibit. And the God who found that gap, the God who had been preparing to find it through 8 separate prior interventions spanning what the tablets suggest is an enormous period of divine management of the human project. The God whose name means Lord of the Earth, in one interpretation, and whose house is the water in another, is the same God who designed us. Who chose which blood to mix with the clay? Who built the Apkallu and gave them to the cities? Who spoke to the wall? The question the pattern forces is one that the ancient astronaut researchers and the more careful mythologists and the comparative religion scholars who have spent careers with these texts all arrive at eventually, from different directions and with different frameworks, but at the same place. The pattern of 9 interventions is not the pattern of a craftsman protecting a tool. It is the pattern of a being who has a stake in the outcome that the official creation narrative does not account for. The official narrative says Enki made us to work. The pattern says Enki needed us to survive. The gap between those 2 statements is the most interesting unsolved question in the ancient record. Why did the God who made the workers care so much more about the workers than the work? Why did the God who sat in the assembly when the flood was voted accept the flood vote and then spend the rest of the meeting finding a way around it? What was he protecting? The tablets do not give us a direct answer. They give us the blood of Wi Ila mixed into the clay. They give us the May transmitted to Uruk at a party. They give us 7 sages built into a knowledge network before the catastrophe they were designed to survive. They give us a wall and a dream and an argument under pressure. They give us the clay itself, the medium that was chosen for recording all of this, the medium that the God of wisdom and the God of the deep water and the God of craftsmanship chose for the civilization he kept building and rebuilding after everything that was supposed to end it. The clay did not burn. The libraries burned around it, and the dynasties fell on top of it, and the water covered it, and the sand buried it, and then the archaeologists came and dug it up, and the scholars spent lifetimes learning to read it, and here we are, reading it, 4,000 years after it was pressed and fired and stored away. Here we are, asking the same question the patterns demand. Here we are, which is the thing that required 9 interventions and 1 specific gap in 1 specific oath to make possible. We are here because Enki was in the room, and the tablets, written on clay that was chosen because it lasts, were left for us to find. The wider context of the me and why Enki kept them. There is a reading of the me transmission story that the popular ancient astronaut literature has not fully developed, and it concerns the question of timing. Not just the timing of the feast, but the timing of when the me were created, who created them, and what the act of their creation meant for the relationship between divine authority and human capability. The Sumerian texts on the origin of the me are not entirely consistent, which is expected in a tradition that preserved texts across multiple city-states and multiple millennia without a central editorial authority. But the dominant tradition across the major texts treats the me as pre-existing things, not as things that were manufactured by Enki or by the divine assembly at any particular historical moment. They are primordial. They were not invented. They were identified, cataloged, and placed in storage. This has an implication that the texts do not spell out, but that follows from the cosmological framework. The me were always available, in principle, to anything or anyone capable of receiving and using them. The scribal art does not only work when Enki authorizes it. It works when a being with the right cognitive architecture and the right social context applies it. Enki had not created the scribal art by keeping it in the Abzu. He had simply kept it out of reach of the beings who could use it. This means the threat the me represented to the divine management system was not a threat of something new being introduced to human experience. It was a threat of something that was always potentially accessible being made actually accessible. The difference between a human civilization that has writing and one that does not is not a difference in what humans are capable of in principle. It is a difference in what they have been given access to. Enki's contribution, in this reading, was not providing the capacity, it was providing the access. Why does this matter for the ranking? Because it clarifies what Enlil's program of managed human limitation actually was. It was not preventing humans from developing abilities they did not have. It was preventing humans from accessing abilities they would naturally develop the moment the relevant tools and organizational structures were made available to them. The me being in the Abzu was a supply-side restriction on human cultural development, not a fundamental biological limitation. And that is a much more fragile management system than it appears to be, because it depends entirely on controlling the supply, and control of the supply depends entirely on Enki's cooperation. Enki's cooperation was conditional. As the Inanna and Enki text demonstrates, the condition under which it could be withdrawn was apparently a party with sufficiently good beer. There is also the question of what the me's arrival in Uruk produced in material terms, and the archaeological record of Uruk from the relevant period is one of the most discussed topics in ancient Near Eastern archaeology for a reason. The Uruk period, which archaeologists date to roughly the 4th millennium before the Common Era, is characterized by an explosion of cultural and organizational complexity that has no clear precedent in the preceding Ubaid period. Writing appears. The cylinder seal appears. Monumental temple architecture appears. Long-distance trade networks appear. Administrative record-keeping on a large scale appears. The organizational complexity of a genuine urban civilization appears, at Uruk specifically, in a time frame that has been described in the scholarly literature as anomalously rapid. The archaeologist Hans Nissen, who spent decades studying the Uruk expansion, documented the speed and extent of this cultural fluorescence in terms that do not quite have a standard model explanation. Things appear that take other civilizations much longer to develop. They appear at Uruk first, and then spread. Which means Uruk is not merely participating in a regional cultural development, but is leading it, is originating it, is the source from which the components of Mesopotamian civilization diffuse outward. Uruk, the city of Inanna, the city where the me were unloaded from the boat of heaven, The coincidence between the ancient text's account of when the May arrived in Uruk and the archaeological record of when Uruk's cultural complexity exploded is not something that most mainstream archaeology addresses directly, because mainstream archaeology does not engage with Sumerian mythological texts as potential historical records. But the coincidence is there, and it is the kind of coincidence that the ancient astronaut researchers find irresistible precisely because it connects a textual event to a material pattern in a way that the conventional mythology as metaphor framework cannot easily explain. The Me arrived in Uruk, and then Uruk became the origin point of complex urban civilization in the ancient Near East. That sequence, text to archaeology, is one of the cleaner data points in the entire ancient astronaut research tradition. The Apkallu and what they actually taught. Returning to the Apkallu for a moment, because the discussion of what they transmitted deserves more depth than the number 8 entry provided, and because understanding what they taught is essential to understanding why the number 3 and number 2 interventions were possible. The cuneiform scholarly tradition has a specific term for the body of knowledge the Apkallu transmitted, Umanu. The Umanu were not just wise men. They were the technical masters of specific disciplines, the keepers of specific crafts, the practitioners of specific knowledge traditions. The distinction between an Umanu and a general scribe or scholar is the distinction between a master and a student. The Umanu possessed the full technical depth of a tradition, not just the introductory level. The Babylonian scholarly lists, which organized knowledge into specific subject areas, each with its own tradition and its own lineage of practitioners, trace every major intellectual discipline of ancient Mesopotamia back to an Apkallu source. Astronomy traces back to the Apkallu tradition. Medicine traces back to the Apkallu tradition. Mathematics traces back to the Apkallu tradition. Divination, the systematic interpretation of omens as a technology for understanding divine intention, traces back to the Apkallu tradition. This is not claimed by ancient astronaut researchers. This is the content of the actual Babylonian scholarly lists, which are part of the cuneiform record and which reflect how the Babylonian intellectual tradition itself understood the origins of its knowledge. The Babylonians who compiled and preserved the Omen series, the astronomical observation records, the medical texts, and the mathematical tables understood these traditions as having been transmitted by the antediluvian sages, the Apkallu, rather than as being products of human intellectual development within historical time. The implication is that the core intellectual infrastructure of the ancient Near Eastern civilizations, the tools of systematic empirical observation, mathematical calculation, medical practice, and cosmological interpretation, were not things that human beings figured out independently. They were things that were taught in a pre-flood period by beings who were operating under Enki's direction from Enki's knowledge base. If you take this seriously as a historical claim, rather than as mythology, the story of ancient Near Eastern intellectual development looks different. The development is not an internal, organic process in which human intellectual capacity gradually discovers tools through trial and error and cultural accumulation. It is an externally seeded process in which the intellectual tools were introduced complete and functional by teachers who had them from a source outside the human developmental process. The tool introduction allowed the human intellectual tradition to begin not at the beginning but somewhere much further along. You are not starting from empirical observation of individual stars and working your way toward a calendar system through centuries of data collection when you receive a calendar system already functional from a teacher who is working out of a deepwater divine domain with a knowledge base that predates the human experiment. You start with the calendar. You start with the ability to organize systematic observation. You start, in other words, much further along than independent discovery would have put you. This is what makes the Apkallu program an intervention that ranks above the Me transmission. The Me gave us the organizational and technical frameworks of civilization. The Apkallu gave us the intellectual tools for understanding and extending those frameworks. The combination of the two meant that human beings who survived any catastrophe would be beginning reconstruction not from primitive tool use, but from a sophisticated technical knowledge base. The flood was supposed to erase civilization. It could not erase everything the Apkallu had taught, because some of it lived in the people, in the practitioners, in the Umanu lineages that continued to exist as long as the practitioners existed. The survivor of the flood carried this. He carried it in the form that the tablets describe him carrying it. The man, Atrahasis, the exceedingly wise one, brings aboard the boat not just animals and seeds, but craftspeople and knowledge workers. The ancient astronaut reading notes that what you need to rebuild a civilization is not just the biological material, the humans who can reproduce, but the technical knowledge that makes civilization possible rather than just survival. The boat carries what the Apkallu built into the human technical tradition. Enki knew what the boat needed to carry because he knew what the Apkallu had transmitted. He designed both. He built the knowledge network, and then he built the mechanism for preserving the knowledge network through the catastrophe that was going to destroy the physical infrastructure it had been stored in. The three reductions. What they reveal about divine authority. The three reduction attempts in the Atrahasis epic deserve more careful attention than the conventional reading gives them, because they are revealing about something that most discussions of the ancient astronaut hypothesis do not engage with directly: the limits of divine authority, when that authority is being systematically worked around by another divine being. Enlil is not, in the Sumerian textual tradition, a weak god. He is the executive of the divine assembly. He holds the tablet of destinies. He has operational control of the major climate systems that determine agricultural productivity in Mesopotamia. He has the cooperation of the divine assembly behind his reduction decisions. He has the divine chain of command, from the storm gods who control rainfall to the irrigation control deities who manage the canals to the divine managers of soil fertility. He has everything that should be necessary to implement a population reduction program effectively. He fails 3 times in a row. And the Atrahasis epic is structured to make the failures cumulative and escalating in a way that is more embarrassing with each iteration. The first failure is subtle. A human organizes a ritual response that redirects the plague's divine bureaucracy. The second failure is less subtle. The food supply restores itself in ways that should not have been possible without divine intervention. The third failure is the most explicit. Enlil calls a divine assembly meeting specifically to address the fact that someone has been undermining his program, and he still cannot stop it. What this sequence demonstrates is that divine authority in the Sumerian cosmological framework is not absolute. It is not the case that a decree from Enlil backed by divine assembly ratification automatically produces the decreed outcome. The outcome depends on implementation, and implementation can be subverted by a sufficiently intelligent divine being who understands the implementation mechanisms better than the being who decreed the outcome. Enki understands the implementation mechanisms better than Enlil does. This is established throughout the Sumerian corpus as a consistent characterization of the two gods. Enlil has authority, Enki has understanding. Enlil can decree. Enki knows how things actually work. And when Enlil's decrees depend on divine mechanisms that Enki understands at a deeper technical level, Enki can insert himself into those mechanisms in ways that produce outcomes different from what Enlil decreed. The agricultural divine bureaucracy, the chain of divine beings responsible for rain and irrigation, and soil fertility and seasonal cycles, is precisely the kind of system that Enki, as the god of the earth and the water and the practical technical knowledge of how things function, understands at the deepest level. He knows not just that Adad controls rain, but what Adad needs and what Adad responds to, and how Adad's function can be worked around or supplemented through alternative water sources. He knows not just that soil needs nutrients, but what specific divine mechanisms produce those nutrients, and how they can be maintained or substituted when the normal divine supply chain is shut off. This is the thing that makes Enki dangerous to Enlil's program, and why the 3 reductions fail. Enlil is turning off switches. Enki knows the wiring and can route around the switches. The 3 failures also explain the logic of the flood. The flood is not a more severe version of the 3 reductions. It is a categorically different approach that is specifically designed to eliminate the routing possibilities that Enki exploited in the first 3 attempts. The flood does not operate through divine bureaucratic mechanisms that can be individually subverted. It is a single overwhelming event that exceeds the capacity of any localized divine intervention to counteract. You cannot route around a total flood the way you can route around a drought, because a drought has geographic limits, and a flood of the Atrahasis type has, by design, none. Enki, faced with a mechanism he could not route around, found a mechanism he did not need to route around. Advance warning. He did not try to stop the flood. He could not stop the flood. What he could do was ensure that someone survived it, which was a different problem entirely, and one that the flood's design did not prevent in the same way it prevented routing around the mechanism of the flood itself. The progression from 3 reducible failures to an unreducible flood to an unpreventable but survivable flood is the progression that Enki navigated. And it is only navigable by a being who can distinguish between what he can and cannot change, and who therefore concentrates effort on what he can change when what he cannot change becomes the operative situation. This is not the behavior of a god who is reacting to crises as they arise. This is the behavior of a god who has a consistent long-term objective, who is adapting his methods as the circumstances change, and who is doing so with a sophistication that the divine assembly around him consistently underestimates. The divine assembly as a political system, and what it means for Enki's constraints. Understanding the 9 interventions requires understanding the political system within which Enki was operating, because the interventions are not just clever, they are strategically positioned within a specific political structure in ways that maximize their effectiveness while minimizing the political exposure that could result in a direct confrontation Enki might not win. The Sumerian divine assembly, as the texts describe it across the corpus, is not a monarchy. Enlil is not a god-king whose word is simply law, regardless of what others think. He is a first among equals, or something close to it, within a consultative structure that involves multiple major divine beings, who each have authority within their own domains, and whose cooperation Enlil requires for major decisions. The divine assembly meeting that votes on the flood is not Enlil issuing a decree. It is a group process that produces a collective decision and a collective oath. This matters for Enki's position because it means Enlil cannot simply eliminate Enki for his interference. Enki is not Enlil's subordinate in a chain of command that gives Enlil direct authority over Enki's behavior. Enki is a major Anunnaki in his own right, with authority over his own domain, with his own divine beings under his direction, with a status in the divine hierarchy that makes any direct conflict between Enlil and Enki a political event with consequences that neither can fully control. When Enlil accuses the gods at the post-flood confrontation of having undermined his program, he cannot simply arrest and punish Enki. The structure does not work that way. He can accuse, he can demand accounting, he can build political pressure, but he cannot unilaterally act against Enki in a way that bypasses the assembly structure that governs their relationships. And the assembly structure, as Enki's repeated use of it demonstrates, is a space within which Enki can argue, can marshal the interests of other divine beings, can deploy rhetoric and precedent and moral principle in ways that constrain what Enlil can actually do. This is why plausible deniability matters so much in the early interventions. If Enki can maintain the appearance that he is not deliberately subverting Enlil's programs, then the assembly cannot be mobilized against him specifically. The plague ended through a ritual, not through Enki's direct intervention. The famine broke through an agricultural recovery, not through Enki's public action. The Me reached Uruk because he was drinking at a party. The ambiguity in each of these is not just covering for Enki politically, it is preventing the formation of the divine assembly consensus that would be required to take direct action against him. Only at the post-flood confrontation does the political situation collapse to a point where deniability is no longer available. The survivor is standing on the mountain. The flood has happened. Someone warned someone, and Enlil knows it. Enki's response in that moment, the counter-accusation, and the alternative narrative, is the response of a god who has run out of deniable positions and is now making his case directly, in the open, on the basis of principle and alternative interpretation rather than hidden action. He makes it work. But it is the closest his political position has ever been to unworkable, and the fact that he can make it work in those circumstances is a testament to the sophistication of his argument rather than to the strength of his institutional position. The Adapa incident. What was actually at stake? The Adapa incident is more complicated than even the number 5 entry made it seem, and the complication comes from what the bread and water of life actually represent in the Sumerian and Akkadian cosmological framework. The food of the gods, the specific substances that maintain divine immortality, appears in multiple places across the ancient Near Eastern textual tradition in forms that are consistently described as material substances rather than abstract divine qualities. They are eaten, they are drunk, they are made from something, in specific locations, by specific divine processes. The Sumerian texts about the divine kitchen, about the preparation of divine food, about the specific ingredients and processes involved in divine sustenance, treat these things as technical realities rather than metaphors. The implication is that divine immortality in the Sumerian cosmological system is not a metaphysical property that divine beings inherently possess because of what they are. It is a biological or chemical maintenance condition that divine beings sustain by continuing to consume specific substances. The gods are not immortal in the way a mathematical truth is eternal. They are immortal in the way that a well-maintained machine does not wear out as long as it receives the right inputs. This changes the Adapa story significantly. If the bread of life and the water of life are the maintenance substances that divine beings consume to sustain their immortality, then Anu's offer to Adapa is not a magical gift of eternal life, delivered through a single transformative act. It is the first instance of Adapa beginning to consume divine maintenance substances and therefore entering the maintenance cycle that the gods themselves depend on. Once Adapa begins consuming those substances, he is participating in the same biological maintenance cycle as the gods. Stopping his consumption, after it has started, would presumably produce the same effect that stopping divine consumption produces in the gods: decay, eventual mortality, the kind of divine aging and diminishment that the texts do not describe for functional divine beings, because functional divine beings keep eating the right things. If Adapa had accepted the bread and water, he would not just have become immortal in the moment. He would have become dependent on continued access to the divine food supply to maintain that immortality. He would have been in the divine court, consuming divine resources, participating in the divine maintenance cycle, becoming integrated into the divine sustenance economy in a way that the divine assembly had not authorized. The divine food supply is not infinite in the way the Sumerian texts treat it. The gods need offerings from humans because, the texts suggest, divine sustenance is a closed system with specific inputs. If Adapa is consuming divine sustenance, the consumption comes from somewhere. It comes from the same supply that the gods are sustaining themselves with. An immortal human in the divine court is not just a categorically unprecedented being. He is a consumer of resources in a system that was already balanced at a certain number of consumers. Enki's refusal to let Adapa access this system, whatever the full motivation behind it, preserved a boundary that had practical resource implications as well as categorical ones. The divine food supply economy remained closed to human beings. The human-divine boundary remained in terms of who had access to the specific maintenance substances that the divine side of that boundary depended on. The irony of the situation, which the text seems aware of in its framing of Anu's amazement at Adapa's refusal, is that Enki used his relationship with Adapa, his creation of Adapa, and Adapa's consequent trust in him, to prevent Adapa from accessing the thing that Enki himself, as a divine being, possessed. He used a human's trust in his creator to keep the human on the human side of a boundary that the creator himself was on the divine side of. That is not a comfortable dynamic. The text preserves it anyway. The flood and what the tablets know about water. The Sumerian texts about water are not metaphors. This is important to say because the tendency in both popular and scholarly treatments of Mesopotamian mythology is to read the flood story as a mythologized account of seasonal Mesopotamian flooding, as a culturally processed way of understanding the regular floods that the Tigris and Euphrates produce, and that ancient Mesopotamian civilization was built around managing. The flood in this reading is an extreme version of a normal experience, made cosmologically significant by a culture that lived with water as a constant environmental fact. But the Atrahasis epic's description of the flood does not match seasonal river flooding in any detail. The flood in the Atrahasis text and in the Gilgamesh version is not a river flood. It is described in terms of the heavens, the subterranean sources, the simultaneous engagement of every water source available to divine beings operating across the full scope of the divine management system of the earth. It is not the Tigris overflowing. It is the Abzu being opened, the heavens being opened, every water-controlling divine being executing a simultaneous program on a single night. This is geologically significant in a specific way. The simultaneous engagement of both surface water systems, rainfall and river flood, and subsurface water systems, the aquifer that Enki controlled through the Abzu, would produce a total inundation event that differs qualitatively from any normal flooding event. Rainfall and river flooding leave high ground above water, an event that simultaneously raises the water table from below and produces precipitation from above, while flooding all river systems can eliminate the high ground refuge that normal flooding leaves. The ancient astronaut researchers, and more recently some geologists working on the Black Sea flood hypothesis and the general question of catastrophic marine transgression events in the ancient Near East, have noted that there are geological records of events in the region that fit the total inundation description of the Atrahasis flood better than any model of normal river flooding does. The Black Sea appears to have undergone a catastrophic inundation event from the Mediterranean, possibly through the Bosphorus, at a date that some estimates place in the 6th millennium before the Common Era. The Persian Gulf underwent a dramatic infilling event at the end of the last ice age that converted what had been an inhabited river valley into a shallow sea, a process that some scholars have suggested may be encoded in the Sumerian cosmological tradition of a primordial sea that preceded the organized land of the Mesopotamian civilization. Whether either of these events is the specific geological reality behind the Atrahasis flood narrative is debated. What is less debated is that catastrophic total inundation events happened in the region, that they happened within the time frame that could be relevant to the Sumerian textual tradition, and that the specific description of the flood in the tablets is more consistent with a real catastrophic event of large scale than with a mythologized version of ordinary seasonal flooding. The reason this matters for the intervention ranking is that it supports the reading of the flood as a real event that produced a real existential crisis for the human species, not a mythological narrative that encodes a cultural processing of normal experience. If the flood was a real event of the scale the tablets describe, then Enki's intervention was not a symbolic act in a mythological narrative. It was an actual intervention in an actual existential catastrophe, and the outcome of that intervention, one surviving family, was the actual margin between human extinction and human continuation. The margin was not metaphorical. The wall conversation was not symbolic. The argument on the mountain was not a literary device for exploring the human-divine relationship. They were, in the reading that takes the tablets seriously, the specific events that determined whether the thing we are currently doing, living, would be possible at all. The legacy of the 9, what they add up to. When you step back from the individual items on the list and look at the 9 interventions as a sequence, a structure emerges that is more coherent than the sum of its parts. Each intervention addressed a different threat type. The Mi addressed the long-term suppression of human cultural capacity. The Apkallu addressed the knowledge accumulation gap that a catastrophe would produce. The 3 reductions addressed the progressive policy shift toward total elimination. The Anzu crisis addressed the loss of the political framework within which Enki could operate. The Adapa incident addressed the categorical boundary whose crossing would have changed the divine political economy in ways dangerous to human survival. The post-flood reconstruction addressed the cultural erasure the flood was designed to produce. The wall conversation addressed the total extinction event itself. The mountain confrontation addressed the completion of the extinction event after it was discovered to be incomplete, and the assembly moment addressed the prerequisite for all of it. These are not 9 separate, unrelated interventions. They are 9 stages of a program. They are systematically progressive in the sense that the interventions at the lower numbers on the list were preparations for the interventions at the higher numbers, and the higher-numbered interventions would not have been possible without the lower-numbered ones having succeeded. The Mi transmitted to Uruk are in Uruk because they went there before the flood. The flood survivor carries the scribal tradition because the Apkallu transmitted it before the flood. The flood survivor survives the confrontation on the mountain because Enki has an argument to make, and the argument works because Enlil's program of reduction was imperfect and demonstrably unjust, which Enlil knows because he knows it failed 3 times. The argument that Enki makes on the mountain, the moral argument about collective punishment, is an argument that only has purchase in a divine assembly, where the failed 3 reductions establish the pattern. If Enlil had succeeded on the first attempt, or the second, or the third, the flood would have come to a context in which there was no established record of Enlil's overreach that Enki could appeal to. The 9 interventions built the conditions for each other's success. This is what distinguishes them from 9 unrelated instances of divine mercy toward humanity. Divine mercy is episodic and does not depend on sequence. Strategic preparation is sequential and builds on itself. The structure of the 9 interventions is the structure of strategic preparation, not the structure of episodic mercy. The God who did this understood what he was doing. He understood it over a time frame that the tablets suggest was enormous. He adjusted his methods as circumstances changed. He maintained his institutional position within the divine assembly throughout, even when that position was under direct challenge. He found the loopholes before he needed them. He made the arguments before the arguments were needed. He built the infrastructure before the catastrophe. And then he spoke to a wall. The wall is the thing that the ancient astronaut literature loves most about Enki because it is the most vivid single moment in the entire record of divine-human interaction. A god, with the intelligence to design the human species, with the wisdom to understand the divine oath's exact language, with the foresight to prepare the knowledge networks and the survival boat and the post-catastrophe reconstruction program, and his preferred method at the crucial moment is to go talk to some reeds. It is a perfect piece of theater. Whether it was theater in the ancient sense, a performance that everyone watching understood was performing something, or whether it was genuinely the specific technical mechanism that allowed Enki to satisfy the oath's letter while violating its spirit, the result is the same. A human being heard, a human being understood, a human being built a boat, and here we are. The clay that remembered. Everything about the Sumerian textual tradition that we have been discussing in this video comes to us through clay. The tablets were made of clay. The writing was impressed into clay with a reed stylus while the clay was wet, and then the clay was either fired, which made it permanent, or simply dried, which made it durable enough to survive if conditions were right. If humidity was low and no one deliberately broke it, and the fire that eventually destroyed the libraries burned everything else but left the clay in a hardened state that was actually more durable than unfired tablets. The cuneiformists who first worked on the tablets from Nineveh and Nippur and Lagash in the 19th and early 20th centuries noted that they were working with material that had survived not because it was well preserved in the place, conventional sense, but because it was inherently resistant to the most common preservation enemies. Water, which destroys papyrus and organic writing materials, does not damage fired clay and can leave dried clay in a state that is recoverable after significant soaking. Fire, which destroys everything except stone, actually makes clay more durable by firing it through processes identical to pottery kilns. The libraries burned, and the clay tablets of those libraries are, in many cases, in better condition than they were before the fire because the fire did what the Sumerians themselves did to important tablets they wanted to preserve permanently. This has led some researchers, including those working within the ancient astronaut framework, to note that clay was not chosen arbitrarily as the medium for the Sumerian and Babylonian textual traditions. It was chosen, or continued to be used, in a tradition that began with specific environmental affordances, but that was sustained in part because it worked as a long-term preservation medium in ways that other available materials did not. Papyrus does not survive Mesopotamia's climate or its occasional flooding. Wood does not survive humidity cycles. Stone is too labor-intensive for the volume of administrative and literary text that the Sumerian tradition was producing. Clay was abundant, workable, and when treated correctly, more durable than almost anything else available in the ancient Near Eastern environment. The Apkallu, who were described as teaching the scribal art, were teaching writing on clay. Enki, who was described as the god who loves clay, was the patron deity of the material that turned out to be the most effective long-term information storage medium available to ancient Mesopotamian civilization. The knowledge that Enki's sages transmitted was preserved in the material that Enki was associated with. The records of Enki's own interventions were preserved in the material that Enki's tradition favored. If you approach this from the outside, without any commitment to the ancient astronaut framework or to the conventional mythology as metaphor framework, the pattern is interesting regardless of how you interpret it. A tradition associated with a specific divine being produces vast quantities of text on a specific material. That material turns out to be more durable than almost any alternative the tradition could have chosen. The text preserved in that material includes, among other things, detailed accounts of that same divine being's repeated interventions to ensure human survival. And the humans descended from the survivors of those interventions eventually dig up the material, reconstruct the tradition, and read the accounts. The accounts include what you need to know to ask the next question. The question being, if the clay was chosen deliberately, if the scribal tradition was established specifically because clay lasts, if the information encoded in the clay was selected or shaped by beings who understood what they wanted preserved and why, then the tablets are not just a historical record, they are a transmission. Something sent forward through time, in a medium chosen to reach whatever came after the ancient Near Eastern civilizations in a form that could be decoded. This may be too much to claim. The tablets contain administrative records and commercial transactions and literary texts and astronomical observations and legal codes and school exercises, and most of this content is not the kind of thing that a deliberate long-term transmission program would bother encoding. It is the ordinary documentation of a civilization going about its business. But the Atrahasis epic is there. The Inanna and Enki text is there. The Oedipus myth is there. The Era epic is there. The Anzu myth is there. The king list is there. The hymns to Enki are there. And in all of these texts, across all of these clay surfaces, in all of the libraries from Nineveh to Nippur to to Eridu, the same story is told in different fragments and different angles and different moments in the same narrative. A God who should not have helped us kept helping us 9 times across an enormous stretch of time using methods that grew more direct and more desperate as the threat grew more total. The story is in the clay. The clay survived. We are reading it. The question that ends every serious engagement with this material, the question that the ancient astronaut researchers ask and that the comparative mythologists ask and that the cuneiformists who have spent careers with this material sometimes ask in their more reflective moments, is the same question. Not who was Enki. Not whether the Anunnaki were aliens or gods or something else the modern vocabulary does not have a clean word for. The question is simpler and stranger. Why does the story want to be told? The clay survived 4,000 years. It survived civilizations rising and falling on top of it. It survived deliberate destruction and accidental preservation, and the specific peculiarity of fire that makes clay harder rather than breaking it. It survived until human beings with sufficiently developed archaeological and linguistic tools could find it and read it. And what it says, across all of its fragments and versions and iterations, is the same thing. You were supposed to not exist, and a specific being made sure you did anyway. That is a message. Whether it was intended as one, or simply arrived as one, through the operation of the specific physical properties of fired clay, it is a message that you are reading now, in this specific form, because someone asked these questions and assembled these sources, and because the clay lasted. Enki, if the ancient astronaut researchers are right about what he was, understood the message problem. He understood that survival is not enough if the survivors do not know what they survived or why it mattered. He built the Apkallu to transmit knowledge. He arranged for the me to reach the cities. He ensured that the post-flood reconstruction was fast enough to produce a literate civilization capable of writing down what happened. He kept the human experiment alive long enough for it to develop the capacity to understand what the experiment was. And then the experiment developed that capacity. You are here. You are using the capacity. You are reading the records of the interventions that produced you, in a medium chosen for longevity, finding in those records the question that the records were apparently designed to raise 9 times. The same God, the same direction, across the full span of a civilization's records, pressing out on clay, preserved in fire, buried in sand, and waiting for you to find it and ask why. The pattern does not resolve into accident or error when followed through all 9. It resolves into intent, into a consistent objective, pursued across an enormous stretch of time by a being who kept finding the angle that worked when every other angle was closed. That is what all 9 interventions add up to. The question of Enki's motivation and what the texts actually say about it. Every serious engagement with Enki in the Sumerian and Akkadian corpus eventually arrives at the question that the popular treatments tend to sidestep because it does not have a clean answer. What did Enki want? Not what he did, which is documented across the texts in considerable detail. What he wanted, which the texts approach obliquely through hymns and characterizations and the specific framing of his actions, but which they never address as directly as a modern reader would like. The hymns to Enki are the best source for this question, and the Sumerian hymnal tradition is extensive. The hymns to the major Anunnaki were composed over a period of centuries, revised, updated, and used in temple contexts where they functioned both as liturgical texts and as theological statements about the nature of the divine beings they celebrated. They are not objective biographies. They are promotional literature, in a sense. But promotional literature is revealing in specific ways. It shows what the tradition wanted to claim about a divine being, what qualities were considered praiseworthy, what actions were considered appropriate for celebration. The hymns to Enki consistently emphasize several qualities that are worth examining carefully. Wisdom, as expected. Technical knowledge, as expected. Command of the Abzu, as expected. But also, and this is the quality that appears most consistently and that the popular treatments tend to underemphasize, love. The hymns to Enki describe him as a divine being who loves, not in the abstract sense that is conventional for divine beings who are supposed to love their worshippers. In specific ways, directed at specific beings, with consequences that the hymns present as praiseworthy rather than as weakness. He loves the black-headed people. The hymns say this: the black-headed people are the Sumerians, or humanity more broadly in the Sumerian textual tradition, and the statement that Enki loves them is made in hymns that were being recited in temple contexts, where the statement would be heard and processed as a serious theological claim about who Enki was. Not that he managed humanity, or that he found humanity useful, or that he had designed humanity and was satisfied with the product, that he loved them. The creation of the pickaxe, a Sumerian literary text about the divine creation of an agricultural tool, shows Enlil creating the pickaxe and presenting it to humanity for agricultural labor. Enki's relationship to this gift, in the relevant texts, is characterized by something the scholarly translations describe as joy at the humans receiving what they need. Not administrative satisfaction. Joy. The same word the Inanna and Enki text uses for Enki's emotional state at the party where he gives away the me. The Enki and the World Order text, which is one of the most comprehensive statements in the Sumerian tradition of Enki's role in organizing the cosmos, shows him going through the world and assigning divine personnel to manage every domain of activity, from agriculture to animal husbandry to the rivers to the cities. Each assignment is made with language that suggests care and attention to the specific qualities of each domain and each assigned deity. He is not just allocating administrative functions. He is matching, with characteristic attention to the details of how things actually work, the specific divine being to the specific task in a way that will produce good outcomes. This quality, the attentiveness to how things actually work, the engineering level care about whether the assignments will produce good outcomes rather than just whether the organizational chart is formally correct, is visible throughout Enki's characterization in the Sumerian corpus. He is the god who wants things to actually work, not just to be formally organized. And this quality extends to his relationship with humanity. The ancient astronaut researchers have suggested, in various forms across the literature, that Enki's motivation for the 9 interventions is something that the Sumerian texts partially encode and partially leave unspoken. The most developed version of this suggestion involves the blood of We-Ila, the divine being whose etemu, whose personality essence, was mixed into the human clay at creation. If We-Ila's divine nature was genuinely incorporated into the human template, then human beings carry something that was, before the creation event, not a human thing at all. They carry a fragment of divine personality. They carry, in the framework of the Sumerian texts, something that is related to the divine beings in a way that the Lulu as Tool narrative does not acknowledge. If Enki knows this, if Enki chose We-Ila specifically because he intended for the mixed nature of the resulting being to produce something different from the pure Tool Lulu that the divine assembly voted for, then the 9 interventions are not surprising. They are the logical continuation of the original creative decision. He did not make a tool. He made something with a divine spark in it, and he has been protecting that divine spark from the entities who see only the tool and want to reduce or eliminate it because the tool is inconvenient. This reading does not require accepting the ancient astronaut hypothesis in any strong form. It does not require positing alien beings or extraterrestrial technology or any specific cosmological claim that goes beyond what the Sumerian texts explicitly say. What it requires is taking seriously the claim the texts make about We-Ila's blood in the clay. That claim is in the Atrahasis epic. It is in the Enki and Ninmah text. It is not an ancient astronaut addition to the textual record. It is what the texts actually say about how we were made. If the texts are right about We-Ila's blood being in us, then Enki's interventions are not charity. They are, in a specific sense, reciprocity. A fragment of something divine was used to make us. The being who made that decision kept the consequences of that decision alive across 9 separate attempts to erase them. He owed something to the thing he had made, and he paid it 9 times. The last time with everything on the line, the Sumerian king list and what it knows about time. The Sumerian king list's pre-flood reigns, those numbers in the thousands and tens of thousands of years that make conventional historians treat the document as mythology, deserve more careful attention than they typically receive, because the numbers are not random. They are organized. They follow patterns that suggest they encode something, rather than simply inflating historical reigns for symbolic or literary purposes. The 8 pre-flood kings in the canonical versions of the king list reign for a total of 241,200 years across 5 cities. If you take the individual reign lengths and work with them mathematically, patterns emerge. Several scholars, including Thorkild Jacobsen, in his extensive study of the king list, noted that the numbers appear to be based on a counting system that is not the base 10 system we use, but the Sumerian sexagesimal system, the base 60 counting system that the Sumerians used for mathematics, astronomy, and timekeeping. In base 60, the large numbers become meaningful rather than absurd. They are not exaggerations of historical reigns. They are precise counts in a counting system the modern world mostly abandoned, but which the Sumerians considered the most fundamental mathematical structure in the universe. If the pre-flood reign lengths are sexagesimal counts rather than decimal ones, and if they count something other than what we conventionally call years, the numbers can be read as encoding real-time spans in a non-obvious way. Various researchers have proposed that the numbers count lunar months, or seasons, or agricultural cycles, or some other time unit that was natural to the Sumerian administrative context. Some of these proposals produce reign lengths that are historically anomalous but not biologically impossible. Others produce numbers that suggest the pre-flood period was not years of human reign at all, but something else. Perhaps years of divine administration before the human administrative tradition was established. The ancient astronaut reading of the king list takes this last suggestion and extends it. If the pre-flood numbers count divine administrative periods rather than human reign lengths, if the 5 pre-flood cities and their 8 rulers represent divine beings, administering the human experiment before the flood rather than human kings, with implausibly long reigns, then the king list is not inflating human history. It is recording something different from human history, the divine administrative history of the earth before the event that reset the human experiment. In this reading, the pre-flood section of the king list is a record of the period we have been discussing in this video, the period of divine management of the Lulu project, the period of the 3 reductions, the period of the Apkallu and the Mi and the Adapa incident and the Anzu crisis, the period that ended with the flood, and the post-flood section is where human history in the conventional sense actually begins, with the compressed recovery that archaeology shows in the early dynastic period. This does not resolve the numerological questions. It reframes them, and the reframing is useful because it connects the king list to the flood narrative in a way that makes both more internally consistent. The pre-flood section is not human history inflated. The post-flood section is human history, beginning after the flood, recovering at the rate Enki's intervention made possible. The specific language of the tablets and why it matters. One of the persistent frustrations in popular discussions of the Sumerian texts is the degree to which translation choice shapes the meaning the modern reader receives. The Sumerian and Akkadian languages are not just old languages that have been straightforwardly decoded. They are languages with complex semantic ranges, with grammatical structures that do not map cleanly onto European languages, with contexts of use that are only partially understood because we are working with a specific sample of texts from a specific set of contexts, not with the full language as native speakers used it. The word we have been translating as create in discussions of the human creation narratives is a good example. The Sumerian word typically translated as create in the context of Enki and Ninmah's making of humanity is not the same word used for the divine ordering of existing material in cosmological texts. The creation of humanity involves a different verbal complex, one that scholars have described as having overtones of shaping, of mixing, of the kind of hands-on transformation of material that a craftsman performs rather than the kind of sovereign declaration that a supreme being might issue. Enki does not create humanity the way that Marduk in the later Babylonian Enuma Elish imposes order on chaos. Enki makes humanity the way a potter makes a vessel, with hands and clay, with specific materials, with a specific technical process. This matters for the ancient astronaut reading, because the specific verbal complex implies a physical process, not a magical or supernatural one. The mixing of clay and divine blood in the creation narrative is described as a physical procedure performed in specific locations, requiring specific ingredients and specific actions. The Enki and Ninmah text describes a banquet setting for the creation. Divine beings present, Enki and Ninmah taking turns shaping the clay models, the birth goddess Nintu performing her role in the process. It reads, in the most accurate translations available, like a description of a laboratory procedure conducted by multiple participants in a controlled setting. The ancient astronaut researchers seize on this because it supports the reading of the human creation as a technological intervention rather than a supernatural one. Genetic manipulation, biological engineering, deliberate hybridization of genetic material from different sources, all of these are the kind of physical, procedure-based processes that the Sumerian verbal complex for human creation is more naturally applied to than the kind of sovereign divine declaration that the creation from nothing traditions of later monotheism describe. Whether this reading is right depends on how seriously you take the Sumerian verbal choices as descriptive of real processes, rather than as the cultural expression of how the Sumerians wanted to imagine divine creative power. It is a question that no amount of textual analysis alone can resolve, because the texts cannot verify themselves. What the texts can do, and what the most careful cuneiform scholars agree they do, is paint a consistent picture of human creation as a collaborative physical process, involving specific materials, producing a specific kind of being with both clay-derived and divine blood-derived characteristics. If that picture is accurate in any sense, the implications for understanding Enki's 9 interventions are significant. The being, whose intelligence and divine personality were mixed into the clay, is in the humans. Not symbolically, physically. Every human being who has ever lived carries, in the framework that the most literal reading of the tablet supports, something that was in a divine being before it was in them, something that connects them, materially, to the divine tier of the Sumerian cosmological hierarchy. Enki knows this because he is the one who mixed it in. He knows what he put in the clay and why. And he has spent In the account, the tablets preserve an enormous period of time, ensuring that the thing he put in the clay gets to keep doing whatever it does in the kind of complex, literate, self-reflective civilization that the human experiment eventually becomes. That civilization, reading these tablets, asking these questions, is the thing he was protecting. Not the workers, not the irrigation canal diggers. The thing that the workers became when Enki kept interfering with the programs designed to keep them small. The unanswered question, and why it stays unanswered. There is a question that this video has been building toward without quite asking, and it is time to ask it directly. Why does the Sumerian textual tradition record these events at all? Not why did the events happen, not why did Enki intervene, but why are there clay tablets that describe these interventions in the specific detail they are described in? Who wrote them? Under what circumstances? With what understanding of what they were writing, and why it needed to be preserved? The scribal tradition in ancient Mesopotamia was not a free press. It was a managed institutional tradition, operating under divine and royal patronage, producing texts that served specific functions in specific contexts: administrative records, religious liturgy, royal propaganda, educational texts for scribal training, literary texts used in temple contexts, astronomical and divinatory records used for managing the relationship between the divine and human worlds. Every text that was written for a reason, and the reason was understood by the scribes who wrote it and by the institutions that supported the scribal tradition. The Atrahasis epic, the Inanna and Enki text, the Adapa myth, the Anzu myth. These texts were used in temple contexts. The scribal schools, the Adaba, used literary texts for training purposes, which means the stories we have been discussing in this video were the training material for Mesopotamian scribes. Young men learning to write on clay were learning to write by copying these stories. They were learning their craft by encoding the accounts of how humanity survived divine attempts to destroy it. This is not a trivial institutional fact. The stories were chosen as training material. They were the texts that the scribal tradition decided were important enough to teach through, which meant they were the texts that a scribe who had completed training would know better than any others. Every trained scribe in Mesopotamia knew the Atrahasis flood story because it was in the scribal curriculum. Every trained scribe knew the Inanna and Enki story. Every trained scribe knew the Adapa story. The implication is that the information about the 9 interventions was not hidden. It was central. It was not esoteric knowledge reserved for priests or nobles. It was the foundation of the scribal education, which meant it was known to everyone who worked in the administrative and religious institutions that used scribal services. The ancient Mesopotamian world was not ignorant of the stories this video has been telling. It was saturated with them. It knew them the way literate people in the modern world might know the stories that are taught in schools, not by having recently read the original texts, but by having absorbed them through 1,000 cultural channels that all trace back to the same foundational material. Why does a civilization choose the story of how it survived divine destruction as the foundational text for its educational institutions? One answer is tradition. Once a text is in the curriculum, it tends to stay there because the people who were trained on it train others on it, and the institutional inertia of a successful educational tradition is considerable, but that answer presupposes the text was chosen for the curriculum in the first place, and the choice of what to put in the curriculum is a choice that reflects something about what the tradition considers most important to transmit. The ancient Mesopotamian scribal tradition considered it most important to transmit accounts of divine creation and modification of humanity, accounts of divine decisions to reduce or eliminate humanity, accounts of specific divine interventions that prevented those decisions from succeeding, and accounts of the human beings who survived those interventions, and of what they knew and did. This is a very specific emphasis. It is the emphasis of a tradition that understood something about where it came from and wanted to make sure that understanding survived. The clay was chosen because it lasts. The stories were chosen because they were the most important stories to tell. And the most important stories to tell were the stories about why human beings exist and what has been done to ensure that they continue to. You are reading those stories now. You are reading them in a form, this video, that is different from clay tablets, but that operates on the same basic principle. Encode information in a medium capable of reaching forward in time to recipients who need it. The scribes who copied the Atrahasis epic in the Adaba were doing something structurally identical to what you are doing right now. They were receiving information about the origin and survival of their species, encoded by those who came before them, in a medium chosen because it could reach them across the intervening time. The question that ends this video, The question that it would not be honest to pretend has been answered is whether the information was originally chosen by the same intelligence that chose the medium, whether the specific stories that ended up in the clay, in the aduba, in the training curriculum of the Mesopotamian scribal tradition, stories that describe Enki's 9 interventions in forms that can be decoded 4,000 years later by people with the right research tools, were placed in that curriculum by the same tradition that built the Apkallu program and gave the me to Uruk and spoke to a wall and made the argument on the mountain. If Enki was building a civilization capable of understanding what happened to it, he needed to build the information transmission infrastructure as well as the survival infrastructure. He needed the scribal tradition, he needed the aduba, he needed the specific texts in the specific curriculum. He needed, in short, everything that the Mesopotamian scribal tradition was and did, including the production and preservation on durable clay of the accounts of his own interventions. The ancient astronaut researchers say yes to this. They say the information in the tablets was put there deliberately by beings who understood that it needed to survive in a medium and an institutional context that maximized its chances of survival. The mainstream scholars say no. The texts are human productions reflecting human cultural processing of natural and social experience, and whatever patterns appear in them are patterns that human beings found meaningful to record rather than patterns that were deliberately encoded by non-human intelligences. Both positions are coherent given what we actually know. Both are honest about the limits of what we actually know. The tablets do not resolve this question, they raise it. 9 interventions. 9 moments when the margin between human existence and human extinction was something you can count. 1 decision in 1 assembly. 1 loophole in 1 oath. 1 family in 1 boat. 1 argument on 1 mountain. 9 times the same direction. 9 times the same result. A species that should not be here. Reading the records of why it is here. On a material chosen because it lasts. The clay is still here. The question is still here. So are you. That is what the tablets are about. That is what they have always been about. The 9 times Enki saved humanity are not 9 separate stories. They are one story, told 9 times in 9 different voices, pressed into 9 different pieces of clay, buried in 9 different ruins, and assembled here into a sequence that ends where it began, with a species that was not supposed to survive, wondering why it did, and finding in the oldest written records of human history a God who kept answering that question with the same answer. He found a way. Every time. 9 times. The wall. The dream. The argument. The oath's exact language. The sages in the cities before the flood. The knowledge in the cities after. The 1 family in the boat. The intervention in the assembly. The specific gap in the specific words of the specific prohibition. That is the story the clay tells. That is the story it has always told. And the clay is still here, which means the story is still being told, which means the question the story is asking has not yet been answered in a way that closes it. The clay keeps telling the story to everyone who can read it, and everyone who can read it keeps arriving at the same place. A God who should not have helped us 9 times, and a species that should not exist, reading about it, 4,000 years later, on a Tuesday afternoon. Why? The tablets do not say. They just say it happened. They press the record into clay and fire it and bury it and wait. And eventually, the shovel finds it. And eventually, someone learns to read it. And eventually they ask the question. That question is yours now. The clay gave it to you. Enki, if the tablets are right about who he was and what he did, put it there for you. 9 times he made sure you would get here to receive it. What you do with it next is, as far as the tablets are concerned, up to you. They were written to reach someone capable of asking what comes after survival. They were written for a species that had developed enough to understand what it survived and why that mattered. They were written for a civilization literate enough and curious enough and technically capable enough to excavate 4,000-year-old libraries from the sand and spend generations learning to read a dead writing system in a dead language and then ask, in living languages, what all of it means. They were written for you. The clay survived to reach you. The story in the clay is about what it cost to make sure you got here. 9 interventions. 9 close calls ranked by closeness. And above them all, unranked, because it cannot be ranked, the question that the entire sequence was built to deliver to a species capable of receiving it. The tablets are done. The question is not. The archaeology of Enki's city and what it reveals. Eridu. The city the Sumerian tradition identifies as the first city, the city where kingship descended from heaven before the flood, the city most consistently associated in the texts with Enki's direct presence and divine patronage. Eridu is also the city that archaeologists have identified as one of the oldest, continuously occupied urban sites in Mesopotamia, a site whose excavation history stretches across more than a century of work and whose material record confirms a settlement beginning in the Ubaid period, roughly 6,000 years before the Common Era, that continued through the Sumerian dynastic periods and into later periods of Mesopotamian history. The Eridu excavations, conducted primarily by the Iraqi Department of Antiquities and its international partner organizations in the mid-20th century, produced one of the most remarkable temple sequences ever documented. At the lowest levels of the site, beneath the accumulated debris of thousands of years of occupation, excavators found the remains of a small building identified as a temple, a single rectangular room, a pedestal that had supported a cult statue or offering table, a small amount of ash indicating offerings, and under the floor a cache of fish bones. The fish bones were the religious residue of the offerings made to the patron deity of that first building. The deity associated with fish at Eridu is Enki. Above this first building, the excavators found another building, slightly larger, positioned on the same orientation, constructed over the leveled remains of the first. And above that, another. And above that, another. The temple sequence at Eridu shows 18 distinct phases of construction, each building constructed over the remains of its predecessor, each one successively larger and more elaborate, spanning from the Ubaid period through to the 3rd millennium urban period when the temple complex at Eridu would have been comparable to the great temples of Ur and Nippur, 18 phases. Continuous religious use of the same site across what the stratigraphic sequence suggests is several thousand years. This continuity matters for the ancient astronaut reading because it suggests that the Enki cult at Eridu was not a later invention imposed on an earlier site. It was present from the beginning of the site's occupation. The first building in the sequence, the smallest and oldest, was already an Enki temple. The tradition of Enki at Eridu did not develop over time. It was there when the first human beings built the first building on the site. The fish bones in the temple's offering deposits appear in every phase of the sequence. Fish to Enki, from the earliest Ubaid occupation through the urban period. The deity was consistent. The offering type was consistent. The location was consistent. What changed was the scale and complexity of the temple, not the identity of who the temple was for. The Sumerian texts consistently identify Eridu as Enki's city and the place where the kingship of Sumer originated. The king list says kingship descended from heaven to Eridu. The Eridu Genesis text describes the divine creation of cities beginning with Eridu. The texts about the flood describe the survivor as connected to Shuruppak, a city that the tradition associates with proximity to Eridu's divine patronage network. And the texts about the post-flood reconstruction show civilization being re-established in ways that trace back to Eridu as an organizational starting point. The archaeology and the texts converge on Eridu in a way that is unusual in ancient Near Eastern studies. Usually texts about ancient cities and the archaeological record of those cities are in a complicated relationship, with the texts reflecting idealized or politically motivated versions of the past, and the archaeology revealing a messier material reality. At Eridu, the text tradition that identifies it as the first city, as Enki's city, as the starting point of civilization, is corroborated by an archaeological record that shows continuous occupation from a period earlier than any other major Mesopotamian site, continuous religious use of the same temple location across thousands of years, and a material culture that transitions into the Uruk period complexity that archaeologists identify as the first genuine urban civilization. The connection to Enki is the thread. Eridu is Enki's city. Eridu is the first city archaeologically. The first post-flood city in the king list is Kish, but Eridu is the first city in the pre-flood list, and the texts associate the post-flood reconstruction specifically with the divine patronage system that Enki controlled. The Apkallu sages operated from the Abzu, which is conceptually and geographically associated with Eridu and its marshy coastal environment on the edge of what would have been the ancient Persian Gulf coastline, before the sea level changes of the post-glacial period pushed the coastline to approximately its modern position. What Eridu is, in the combined archaeological and textual record, is the persistent physical location of Enki's influence on the human experiment. It is the city that existed before the flood and that had the specific connection to Enki that the texts describe. Tract. It is the city whose archaeological record shows the most ancient evidence of the organizational complexity that the texts associate with divine gift rather than organic human development. And it is the city whose continuous temple sequence shows a religious tradition maintaining its connection to the same deity, with the same offering practices, from the earliest occupation of the site to its abandonment in the late 3rd millennium. The archaeology of Eridu is not proof of anything the ancient astronaut researchers claim, but it is consistent with those claims in specific and non-trivial ways, and it is inconsistent with the casual dismissal of the Sumerian textual tradition as pure mythology in ways that matter for how seriously the tradition's claims about Enki should be taken. The Abzu and what it actually was. The Abzu is consistently described in the Sumerian texts as a place, a real, physical, accessible location that specific divine beings could enter and exit. Enki's house is in the Abzu. The Apkallu came from the Abzu. The Mi were stored in the Abzu. Inanna came to the Abzu to visit Enki. It is a specific location with a specific deity, specific residence, and specific contents. The conventional understanding of the Abzu is cosmological. It is the primordial sweetwater ocean that underlies the Earth in the Sumerian cosmological framework, the subterranean freshwater reservoir that feeds springs and rivers and wells. This is accurate as far as it goes. The Sumerians did understand the Abzu as the source of fresh water, as the subterranean counterpart to the salt water of the sea above. Enki, as the god of the Abzu, is Enki as the master of the freshwater sources that Mesopotamian agriculture depends on. But the Abzu in the texts is also a place you can go to. Inanna goes there for a feast. The Apkallu return there between their periods of instruction in the human cities. Adapa goes to the Abzu in his capacity as a priest of Eridu. It is not just a cosmological concept. It is a location in the geographic landscape that specific beings can access through specific means. The geography of Eridu makes this more concrete. The site of ancient Eridu sits at the edge of the southern Mesopotamian marshes, in an environment that was, in the periods of maximum Mesopotamian occupation, characterized by extensive reed marshes, lagoons, and shallow coastal waters where the rivers met the ancient Persian Gulf. The freshwater underground sources in this environment were substantial. The southern Mesopotamian plain sits above significant groundwater deposits, and in the marshland environment of ancient Eridu, the boundary between surface water and subsurface water was permeable in ways that it is not in drier environments. An underground freshwater environment in the southern Mesopotamian marshland, accessible from the surface through the marsh channels and underground water systems, would be exactly what the Sumerian texts describe as the Abzu, a below-water domain connected to the surface through specific access points, capable of supporting the activities that the texts describe as being carried out there. Not a cosmological abstraction, a real environment with real physical properties in a real geographic location. The ancient astronaut researchers extend this reading further. If the Abzu was a real physical location, it was a location where Enki and the beings under his direction actually existed and operated. The specific description of the Apkallu as fish garment-wearing beings who moved between the Abzu and the human cities is, in this reading, a description of beings who lived in a subaquatic or amphibious environment and who made periodic surface excursions to interact with human communities. The fish garment is the equipment they use to operate in both environments. The bandudu and mulilu they carry in the iconographic tradition are the tools of their transmission mission, not symbolic religious objects. Whether this reading of the Abzu is correct depends on assumptions about what kind of claims the Sumerian texts are making, which is the same epistemological problem that runs through all engagement with this material. The texts describe the Abzu as a specific place with specific characteristics. Whether they are describing a real place with those characteristics, or encoding a cosmological concept in geographic terms, is a question the texts cannot definitively answer for us. What the text can tell us is that the Abzu was associated with Enki in all its aspects, as the source of agricultural water, as the location of Enki's house, as the storage place for the Mi, as the origin point of the Apkallu, as the domain from which Enki's interventions in human affairs were organized and executed. Whatever the Abzu was, it was the base of operations for the 9 interventions we have been discussing. It was the place from which the programs that kept humanity alive were designed and executed. And it was located at Eridu, in the marshes, on the edge of the ancient sea, at the site where the archaeological record shows continuous occupation and continuous religious practice from the earliest period of Mesopotamian settlement, at the site where the oldest Enki temple shows fish offerings in the first building and shows 18 phases of continuous religious use above it. The Abzu was real, in whatever sense the Sumerian tradition used the word real, and the things that came out of it, the Mi, the Apkallu, the interventions in the human experiment, The 9 events we have been examining in this video shaped the world in ways that are visible in the material record 4,000 years later. Enki and Enlil, a relationship that explains everything. The relationship between Enki and Enlil is the structural axis of the Sumerian divine narrative, the thing that gives the texts their dramatic tension and that makes the 9 interventions possible to understand as a coherent sequence rather than as 9 unrelated events. They are brothers. This is consistent across the texts. Sons of Anu, the high god, born to different mothers in most versions of the divine genealogy. Half-brothers in a system where divine parentage and divine authority are complexly intertwined, and their relationship, as the Sumerian texts present it, is defined by a specific and productive tension that neither pure alliance nor pure conflict captures. They need each other, and they oppose each other simultaneously, across every text in the corpus where both appear. Enlil has authority. He is the executive of the divine assembly. He holds the tablet of destinies. He sets policy. He decrees. His authority over the other Anunnaki is real and is recognized in the texts as legitimate within its scope. He is not a tyrant in the sense of a being whose authority has no basis. He is the administrative head of a divine governance system, and the governance system works, most of the time, within the parameters he sets. Enki has understanding. He knows things that Enlil does not know and cannot know, because the domain of knowledge is Enki's domain and the domain of authority is Enlil's. What Enki knows about how things actually work, at the technical level, at the engineering level, at the level of what specific mechanisms produce what specific outcomes, exceeds what Enlil knows by a margin that the texts consistently establish as significant. Enlil can decree an outcome. Enki knows whether the decree will actually produce the outcome it is aimed at. This asymmetry of authority and understanding is what makes the divine assembly a system that can be navigated by a sufficiently sophisticated actor within it. Enlil's authority, backed by the Tablet of Destinies and the ratification of the other Anunnaki, appears to be absolute from within the assembly. But Enki's understanding of how things actually work means he can identify the gaps between what the authority decrees and what the mechanisms can deliver. The gaps are where the 9 interventions happen. Enlil decrees drought and disease. Enki understands the ritual mechanism by which divine administrative structures respond to specific human actions, and he routes a workaround through that mechanism. Enlil decrees famine. Enki understands the agricultural support systems in enough technical depth to apply compensatory interventions that Enlil's policy does not prohibit because Enlil did not know to prohibit them. Enlil decrees the flood and swears an oath to keep it secret. Enki understands the oath's language well enough to identify the gap between prohibiting revelation to human beings and prohibiting speech to non-human objects. In every intervention, the same pattern. Enlil's authority is real, but his understanding of implementation is limited. Enki's authority within the assembly is subordinate to Enlil's, but his understanding of implementation exceeds Enlil's by the specific margin needed to make the intervention work. It is as if the system was designed, or had evolved, to always leave room for exactly the kind of intervention Enki kept making. The ancient astronaut researchers find this suspicious. They find it suspicious that the deity specifically positioned as the god of wisdom and technical knowledge, specifically positioned as the creator and patron of humanity, specifically positioned as the master of the underground domain from which the knowledge infrastructure of civilization was distributed, is also the deity whose specific capabilities and whose specific institutional position allow for exactly the kind of repeated intervention in divine policy that kept humanity alive. The positioning looks designed, like someone set it up to work this way. The alternative is that the texts are describing a real political organizational dynamic. The tension between centralized executive authority and specialized technical knowledge is a real organizational tension that appears in human institutions throughout history, and the Sumerian divine assembly is encoding that real organizational dynamic in a cosmological framework. Administrators and engineers, policymakers and technical specialists, the people who decide and the people who understand what decisions will actually produce. This is a real human organizational structure, and the Sumerian gods might be reflecting it rather than exemplifying a cosmological design. Both readings produce the same textual content. Both are consistent with what the tablets say. The difference is in what you think the texts are describing, a real organizational dynamic among real entities, or a human cultural projection of organizational experience onto a cosmological framework. What comparative mythology says about the pattern. The ancient astronaut hypothesis, in its most serious forms, is not just a claim about the Sumerian texts. It is a claim about a pattern that appears across multiple independent mythological traditions from cultures that had no documented contact with each other. A pattern that encodes similar features of divine-human interaction across widely separated geographic and temporal contexts. The flood narrative is the most famous example. The Sumerian Atrahasis flood, the biblical flood of Noah, the Hindu Matsya flood of Manu, the Greek flood of Deucalion, the Mesoamerican flood traditions of the Maya and Aztec calendrical systems, the Australian Aboriginal flood traditions, the Norse flood that precedes the world's current age. These appear in cultures separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years, and they share specific structural features that go beyond the simple observation that floods are a common human experience. The specific features that comparative mythologists have noted as appearing across multiple independent traditions include a divine council, or divine being, that decides to destroy humanity through water, a specific human who is selected and warned in advance, the construction of a watercraft to preserve a representative sample of life, the period of total inundation, the emergence on high ground, a divine sign that the flood will not recur, and the establishment of a renewed relationship between divine and human after the flood. These structural features are specific enough that their appearance in widely separated traditions is statistically unusual if the traditions are purely independent. Joseph Campbell, who spent his career cataloging cross-cultural mythological parallels, identified the flood narrative as one of the most globally distributed mythological motifs. Claude Lévi-Strauss, working from a structuralist rather than a historical basis, noted that the transformation through flood narratives across cultures show structural similarities that suggest either a common origin or a common response to a common experience of a type that has no surviving physical parallel. In the historical period, the ancient astronaut reading of this cross-cultural pattern is that the convergences are not coincidental. They encode real events that were experienced across the inhabited world at approximately the same time, events whose impact was widespread enough to enter the founding mythological traditions of cultures that were geographically separated. The flood was real. It was global or near global. The warning was given. The survival was not accidental. In this reading, Enki's intervention in the Sumerian flood narrative is not a local Mesopotamian story about a local god and a local flood. It is the Sumerian encoding of a real event that left traces in mythological traditions around the world. The divergences between the traditions, the different names, the different specific instructions, the different landing places, are the natural variation that occurs when a real event enters different cultural processing traditions. The similarities are the event itself, preserved in the specific forms each culture had available for encoding important historical events. Whether this reading is right is not something this video can determine. The evidence for it is suggestive but not conclusive. The comparative mythological pattern is real. The similarities across flood traditions are documented and recognized by mainstream comparative mythology, even without the ancient astronaut framing. What the ancient astronaut framing adds is the claim that the similarities indicate a common historical origin rather than a common human psychological response to flood experience, or a diffusion of traditions through cultural contact. The claim is contestable. The pattern is not. The question of the divine council and how decisions were made. One of the features of the Sumerian divine system that the popular ancient astronaut literature discusses, but that deserves more careful treatment, is the decision-making mechanism of the divine assembly. How, exactly, did the Anunnaki make collective decisions? What was the relationship between individual divine authority and collective divine governance? How did an Anunnaki with significant individual power, like Enki, interact with a decision of the assembly that he might not have agreed with? The Sumerian texts provide a picture that is more complex than either a simple monarchy or a simple democracy. Enlil is the executive, but the assembly is the decision-making body. Major decisions, including the flood decree, require assembly ratification. Individual gods have authority within their domains that does not require assembly approval for normal operation, but actions that affect the broader divine management system require consultation or at least notification. This creates a system with interesting properties. Individual divine beings have substantial autonomy within their domains, but are constrained by the assembly for decisions that exceed their domain's scope. Enki has essentially unlimited authority within the Abzu. What happens in the Abzu, who the Abzu's residents are, what knowledge is stored there, what programs the Abzu initiates, and what beings it sends into the human cities, all of this is within Enki's domain authority and does not require assembly approval. This is the institutional basis for Enki's pre-flood interventions. The Apkallu program operated out of the Abzu. It was within Enki's domain authority. The divine assembly might have had opinions about whether sending sages into the human cities was a good idea, but it was not clearly outside Enki's domain authority in a way that required assembly approval, and in the absence of an explicit assembly prohibition, Enki could operate. The Mi were in the Abzu. What happened to them at Enki's feast in the Abzu was, from an institutional standpoint, an internal Abzu matter. Enki gave away what was in his keeping. The fact that what he gave away ended up in a human city might have prompted assembly discussion after the fact, but the act itself, a divine being disposing of the contents of his domain, was arguably within domain authority. This institutional framework helps explain why the interventions worked without immediately triggering a divine assembly response that would have stopped them. Enki was not clearly violating his institutional authority in most of the early interventions. He was operating within it in ways that produced outcomes the assembly would not have approved, but that the assembly's governance structure did not clearly prohibit. The wall conversation is the exception. The wall conversation involved Enki acting in relation to the flood, which was an assembly decree. He was routing around an assembly decision, even if technically through a loophole in the oath's language. This is why the oath and its specific language mattered so much. Enki needed the loophole to be genuine, because a wall conversation that was clearly a violation of the assembly's decision would have been subject to assembly response in ways that a technically non-violating wall conversation was not. The political sophistication of the 9 interventions, seen through the lens of the divine assembly's institutional structure, is remarkable. Early interventions exploit domain authority. Middle interventions exploit ambiguity about what constitutes interference versus normal domain administration. Late interventions exploit the specific language of specific commitments in ways that maintain technical compliance while achieving substantive non-compliance. And the final intervention, the argument on the mountain, moves to direct political advocacy in a situation where technical compliance is no longer possible. This is not the behavior of a god who is improvising. It is the behavior of a god who understands the institutional system he is operating within and who has a consistent, long-term objective that he is pursuing through institutional means for as long as institutional means are available, and through less institutionally comfortable means when they are not. What the ancient astronaut researchers agree on and where they diverge. The ancient astronaut hypothesis is not a monolithic intellectual position. It encompasses a wide range of researchers with significantly different specific claims, different levels of rigor in their engagement with the primary textual and archaeological evidence, and different conclusions about what the evidence actually supports. Zecharia Sitchin, whose work introduced the Anunnaki as extraterrestrial hypothesis to a popular audience through his Earth Chronicles series beginning in 1976, made specific claims about the Anunnaki, that they came from a planet called Nibiru, with a highly elliptical orbit bringing it into the inner solar system approximately every 3,600 years, that they came to Earth to mine gold, which their planet needed for atmospheric protection. They created humanity through genetic manipulation because they needed a labor force for the mining operations. The flood was a naturally occurring catastrophic event that the Anunnaki knew was coming and used as an opportunity to eliminate the labor force they no longer needed. Enki's intervention in the flood was personal rather than policy-driven. Sitchin's work has been both enormously influential and extensively criticized. The criticisms that serious cuneiformists have directed at his translations are substantial. He was not a professional cuneiformist. His translations are selective and sometimes inconsistent with the scholarly consensus on specific terms, and some of his central claims about the textual evidence for Nibiru and the specific details of the Anunnaki as extraterrestrial hypothesis are not supported by the texts he cites as evidence. More recent researchers working in the ancient astronaut tradition have generally acknowledged these limitations while continuing to find value in the broader framework. Andrew Collins, who has engaged with the Göbekli Tepe evidence and its implications for ancient human development, takes a different approach that emphasizes the evidence for a significant pre-flood civilization without requiring the specific claims about Nibiru that have been most extensively criticized in Sitchin's work. William Henry, Jason Martell, and others working in the popular ancient astronaut space have engaged with the Sumerian texts at varying levels of scholarly rigor with varying conclusions. The researchers who engage most directly with the Sumerian textual tradition in the ancient astronaut framework generally agree on several things that are also supported by the scholarly consensus. The Anunnaki were described as physically present divine beings who had direct interaction with humanity, not as abstract supernatural forces. The human creation narrative, in the Atrahasis and Enki and Ninmah texts, describes a physical procedure with specific materials and specific outcomes. The flood narrative describes a real catastrophic event that the divine assembly decided to implement rather than a mythologized version of normal flooding. Enki's role across the pre-flood and post-flood texts shows consistent patterns of protection and support for humanity that differ from the other major Anunnaki's behavior. Where the ancient astronaut researchers diverge from the scholarly consensus is primarily on interpretation rather than on the textual content itself. The mainstream scholarly interpretation treats the Anunnaki as mythological beings, the creation narrative as a creation myth, the flood as a culturally processed catastrophic memory, and Enki's protective role as a theological statement about the nature of divine wisdom and its relationship to divine authority. The ancient astronaut interpretation treats the same textual content as records of real events involving real beings and real interventions. Both interpretations engage with the same texts. The difference is in what the texts are understood to be describing. This is an epistemological question that the texts cannot settle from within, because a text cannot verify its own referential status. The tablets are clay with symbols on them, and the symbols encode information that is consistent with multiple interpretive frameworks. The framework you bring determines what the information means. What this video has tried to do is present the textual content in sufficient detail that you can assess the question with the actual material rather than with popular-level summaries. The 9 interventions are in the texts. The sequence of events is in the texts. The specific mechanisms of each intervention are in the texts. What you do with that content, which framework you bring to it, what questions you think it raises, and which conclusions you find supportable, is your decision to make with the information you now have. The clay does not tell you what to think. It tells you what happened, or what was thought to have happened, or what was preserved in writing because someone considered it important enough to preserve. The rest is yours. The deeper structure. Why 9? Before this video ends, it is worth spending a moment on the number 9 itself, because in the Sumerian numerical tradition, numbers were not arbitrary. The Sumerian sexagesimal counting system treated certain numbers as cosmologically significant in ways that shaped how Sumerian texts organized information. The number 7 was particularly important. 7 sages, 7 tablets of the Gilgamesh epic, 7 days and 7 nights of the flood. The number 12 appears in various divine organizational contexts. The number 3 appears repeatedly in the pre-flood reduction attempts and in other triadic organizational structures across the corpus. 9 is 3 times 3. In Sumerian mathematical and cosmological thinking, multiplication of a significant number by itself produced a number with intensified significance. 9 in this framework is the completion of 3, the number at which a pattern of 3s achieves its fullest expression. The 3 reductions, which occupy entries 7 through 5 on our list, are themselves a triadic structure within the 9 intervention sequence. The 3 that precede the flood, the 3 that constitute the flood, and its immediate aftermath, the oath, the wall conversation, the mountain argument, and the 3 that form the broader frame, the Anzu crisis, the Adapa incident, the post-flood reconstruction, each have their own internal logic. The 9 interventions, counted across the full scope of the available textual record, may not be an accidental number. The Sumerian tradition that preserved these texts also organized information into patterns that reflected cosmological significance. 9 complete interventions, forming a sequence that moved from broad cultural preparation through the extinction crisis to the post-crisis reconstruction, is a 9 that has a shape that the Sumerian intellectual tradition would have recognized as meaningful rather than arbitrary. Whether the 9 was a real count of real events or a number chosen, because the traditions organizing the information found 9 to be the appropriate number for the full expression of this particular story, is another question. The tablets cannot answer from inside themselves. What they show is that the number is coherent, that the 9 items together form a sequence that is both complete and progressive, and that each item contributes something to the whole that the other 8 do not. 1 through 9, ranked by closeness of margin, form a shape that is also a lesson. The interventions at the bottom of the list, where the margin was wide, are the ones that built the conditions for the interventions at the top. The preparation enables the rescue. The rescue enables the reconstruction. The reconstruction enables us. The lesson is about the relationship between long-term preparation and immediate crisis response, and about the insufficiency of either without the other. Long-term preparation, without the ability to respond to immediate crises, leaves all the infrastructure you have built exposed to a catastrophe you cannot prevent. Immediate crisis response without long-term preparation leaves the survivor with nothing to build on. What the 9 interventions together demonstrate is a strategy that operated at both levels simultaneously, building the knowledge infrastructure over a long period while also being ready to route the crisis survival through whatever gap was available in the moment. This is not a strategy that a being without long-term vision could execute, and it is not a strategy that a being without the specific technical capabilities to execute immediate workarounds could sustain. It required, simultaneously, the patience of a being thinking across an enormous time frame and the agility of a being capable of finding loopholes in divine oaths in real time. The 9 interventions are the 9 places where both qualities were required and both were present. That is why it was Enki, not just because he was there, because he was the only one who was both things, the patient builder and the agile solver. The god who designed the Apkallu program decades before the flood, and the god who found the gap in the oath's language in the moment the oath was being formulated. The same being, across 9 different events, applying the same combination of capabilities to different versions of the same problem. The problem was, how do you keep something alive that the people with the authority to kill it have decided to kill? The answer, across 9 interventions, is you build everything it needs to survive before the killing starts. You find the technical gap in the killing mechanism, you route the survival through the gap, and then you make the argument that the survival was justified after the fact. You do all 4, in sequence, every time. 9 times, the problem was the same. 9 times, the answer was the same. The same God, the same approach, the same outcome. We are here because the answer worked 9 times. The clay says so. The clay is still here. That is the story of the 9 times Enki saved humanity. That is all of it. That is what the tablets say, in the most careful reading the available scholarship can give us, in the most complete account that the surviving textual record supports. The rest, as the God of wisdom might say if he were here, is up to you. The texts that have not been found. There is a problem with the Sumerian textual record that the ancient astronaut literature tends to underemphasize, and that the scholarly literature sometimes addresses but rarely features prominently in discussions aimed at general popular readers. Most of it is missing, not lost in the sense that the tablets were destroyed beyond recovery. Missing in the sense that we know, from internal references within surviving texts, that there were many more tablets than we have, and we have not found them. The library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, the single most significant source of cuneiform literature in modern hands, contained by the estimates of its catalogers, in the 7th century, before the Common Era, somewhere between 20 and 30,000 tablets. The British excavations of the mid-19th century recovered approximately 25,000 tablet fragments, not all of which are from the Ashurbanipal collection specifically, and many of which are very small. The complete texts that can be assembled from those fragments number in the hundreds, which means the collection we have is a fraction of the collection that existed, which was itself one library among dozens. The tablets from Nippur, which represent the most extensive surviving corpus of Sumerian literary texts, were excavated by joint American expeditions in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Tens of thousands of tablets were recovered, of which a significant proportion are administrative records and school texts, rather than literary or religious texts. The literary texts from Nippur are the foundation of what we know about Sumerian literature. But Nippur's library, like Ashurbanipal's, is a sample, a significant one, not a complete one. The ancient Sumerian cities of Eridu, Larsa, Uruk, Lagash, Bad Tibira, Larak, and Sippar, the antediluvian cities of the king list, have been only partially excavated. Eridu, Enki's city, has received particular attention. But the urban area of ancient Eridu is extensive, and the excavations that have been conducted represent a fraction of what the site contains. There are tablets at Eridu that have not been found. There are tablets at every major Mesopotamian site that have not been found. The textual tradition we are working with, extensive as it is by the standards of ancient documentation, is an incomplete sample of a much larger body of material. This matters for the question of the 9 interventions because it means the evidence we have is evidence from a sample, not a complete record. The 9 interventions this video has described are the interventions visible in the surviving textual record. There may have been others. There may have been earlier interventions, or later ones, or parallel ones in traditions that have not survived in any readable form. The 9 is a count of what we can see. It is not necessarily a count of what there was. It also means that the specific details of some interventions that we have discussed are details reconstructed from incomplete tablets, with gaps that scholars have filled through context and comparison with parallel passages. The Atrahasis epic has gaps. The Inanna and Enki text has gaps. The Adapa myth has gaps. The Anzu myth has gaps. Every text we have discussed is a reconstruction, sometimes a very careful and well-supported reconstruction, sometimes a more speculative one, from clay fragments that were broken by the accidents of archaeological history. The ancient astronaut researchers tend to read the gaps in ways that are consistent with their broader interpretive framework. The missing material, if found, would support the hypothesis. The mainstream scholars tend to be more cautious about the gaps. They note what is missing and what is uncertain, and attempt to distinguish between what the texts clearly say and what is reconstructed. Both approaches are legitimate, but they produce different pictures of the same material. What is certain is that the Sumerian textual tradition, even in its incomplete surviving form, is one of the most extensive bodies of ancient writing available for study. The amount of material that has been translated, analyzed, and published by cuneiform scholars over the past century and a half is itself enormous. And the picture that emerges from that material, across all of its genres and registers and time periods, is remarkably consistent on the central points this video has been examining. Enki is consistently the divine being most closely associated with human welfare. Enlil is consistently the divine being most closely associated with divine management of the human experiment through reduction and constraint. The tension between them is consistent across the corpus. The specific events we have labeled as interventions are documented across multiple independent textual traditions that confirm each other's accounts in ways that rule out simple scribal invention. The 9 interventions, even acknowledging all of the gaps and uncertainties and reconstruction problems, are supported by the most careful scholarship available on these texts. They are not ancient astronaut inventions. They are in the clay. The astronomical connection and what it might mean. The Sumerian tradition that is most consistently connected to Enki, beyond the creation narrative and the flood narrative, is the astronomical tradition. The god of wisdom is also the god whose domain encompasses the systematic observation and mathematical description of celestial cycles, and this connection is not incidental in a tradition that invested so heavily in astronomical knowledge as a tool for understanding divine intention. The Sumerian astronomical tradition, which passed into the Babylonian astronomical tradition that eventually became one of the foundations of modern astronomy through Greek and Arabic intermediary traditions, is sophisticated in ways that challenge simple models of gradual intellectual development. The Babylonian astronomical texts, which are continuous with the Sumerian tradition, demonstrate knowledge of the synodic periods of the visible planets, of the Saros cycle that allows prediction of solar and lunar eclipses, of the precession of the equinoxes in a form refined across centuries of observation, and of mathematical methods for interpolating planetary positions that are sufficiently precise to be used by modern historians of astronomy as primary sources for historical astronomical events. This knowledge did not appear suddenly in the Babylonian period. The Babylonian texts are themselves the product of a tradition that traces back, through explicit reference to antecedent records and calculation methods, to the Sumerian period. The Sumerian astronomical tradition is the base on which the Babylonian developments were built, and the Sumerian astronomical tradition is one of the things that the Apkallu are credited with having transmitted. The specific astronomical knowledge that the Apkallu are said to have brought includes the organization of celestial phenomena into the systematic framework that allowed prediction rather than just observation. The difference between observing that a lunar eclipse occurred and predicting when the next one will occur is the difference between empirical documentation and mathematical modeling. The Babylonian tradition, which includes prediction, traces back to the Sumerian tradition, which was received from the Apkallu. If the Apkallu transmitted mathematical astronomical knowledge capable of producing accurate predictions, that knowledge came from somewhere. The question is where. Independent Sumerian development of predictive astronomy from observation is not impossible, but it requires a long accumulation of observational data, systematic mathematical development, and institutional continuity of the astronomical tradition across many generations. The traditional archaeological and textual timeline for Mesopotamian civilization allows for this. If the tradition began early enough and was pursued consistently enough, the ancient astronaut reading proposes that the accumulation was not purely organic, that the Apkallu brought astronomical knowledge from outside the human observational tradition, from a source that already possessed the mathematical framework rather than having to develop it from scratch. The fish garment-wearing beings who came from the Abzu and taught the arts of civilization included astronomy in what they taught, and the astronomy they taught was already mathematical and predictive, rather than purely observational. Whether this is right depends on the question of what the Apkallu were and where their knowledge came from, which is the same question the ancient astronaut hypothesis addresses and which the surviving texts do not resolve definitively. What the texts support is that the Apkallu were credited with the transmission of astronomical knowledge, and that the astronomical knowledge of the Babylonian tradition that descended from the Sumerian tradition was sophisticated in ways that require explanation. The connection to Enki is through the Abzu. The astronomical knowledge came from the Apkallu. The Apkallu operated from the Abzu. The Abzu was Enki's domain. Whatever was transmitted through the Apkallu program was, at some level, Enki's responsibility. The astronomical tradition that eventually fed into Greek and Arabic and modern astronomical science traces back, through its Babylonian and Sumerian antecedents, to the same source that this video has been examining across the 9 interventions. Which means that the question of what Enki was and what the Apkallu transmitted is not just a question about ancient history. It is a question about the intellectual foundations of the modern world. The astronomical mathematics that allowed navigation by the stars, that allowed the development of mechanics, that fed into the physics that underlies modern technology. That tradition has roots in the Sumerian astronomical knowledge that the Apkallu program transmitted. If that transmission was the intervention this video counts as number 8, then the intellectual infrastructure of modern civilization is also, in a specific and traceable sense, a consequence of Enki's decisions. This may be too much to claim on the basis of what the texts directly support, but the chain of transmission is real. The Sumerian astronomical tradition is the root of the Babylonian tradition, that is the root of the Greek tradition, that is the root of the Arabic tradition, that is the root of the European tradition, that is the root of modern science. That chain is documented. The Sumerian tradition's connection to the Apkallu program is in the tablets. The Apkallu program's connection to Enki is in the tablets. The tablets are in the clay. The clay is in the museums. The museums are in the cities. The cities are running on the infrastructure of a civilization whose intellectual foundations trace back, through a chain of documented transmission, to a group of beings who wore fish garments, and came from an underwater domain at the edge of the southern Mesopotamian marshes, and taught, among other things, how to watch the sky and predict what it would do. That is what the tablets say. You can follow the chain. The clay holds it. The last thing, every video about Sumerian cosmology and the Anunnaki and the ancient astronaut hypothesis ends in the same place. It ends with the question that the material raises but cannot answer, the question that the gaps in the record and the ambiguity of interpretation and the epistemological limits of working with 4,000-year-old evidence always leave open. The question being, so what do we do with this? The ancient astronaut tradition has a tendency to answer this question in ways that are either dramatic or prescriptive. We need to acknowledge our true origins. We need to reopen our understanding of history. We need to take seriously the possibility that we are not alone and never were. These are real answers to a real question, and they are not wrong to raise. But they do not quite capture the thing that the 9 interventions, taken together as a sequence, actually suggest. The 9 interventions suggest something more specific, and in some ways more demanding. They suggest that we are here not by accident, and not by the uncomplicated benevolence of a universe that wanted us to exist. We are here because someone kept making decisions, under increasingly difficult circumstances, to ensure that we continued. The survival was not given, it was earned, not by us, not in those moments, by a being who was doing something that his peers thought was wrong and that the institutional system he operated within was designed to prevent. What that being was, what his motivations were, whether he was a divine being in a cosmological sense or a physical being in an extraterrestrial sense or a mythological construction in a cultural sense, is a question that honest engagement with the material cannot definitively resolve. But the pattern of the interventions is not dependent on resolving that question. Whatever Enki was, the pattern is in the clay. Whatever the Apkallu were, the knowledge transmission they represent is in the archaeological record. Whatever the flood was, the geological evidence for catastrophic inundation events in the ancient Near East is in the physical record. The minimum claim that survives all skeptical scrutiny of the ancient astronaut hypothesis is this. Human beings in ancient Mesopotamia believed that their existence was not natural and uncontested. They believed they had been made for a specific purpose, by specific beings who did not have their welfare as a primary concern. They believed that the continuation of their existence had required repeated intervention by one of those beings against the explicit policy of the others. And they preserved that belief in clay, that they buried in cities that they built and that eventually fell and were buried in turn. And they preserved it in clay because clay lasts. Whether the belief was true is the question that takes us beyond the tablets. Whether the pattern they encoded deserves our attention is a question the tablets themselves answer. They were preserved, specifically and carefully, in the medium most likely to reach across the maximum span of time to whoever came after. They got here. They reached us. We are reading them. The rest, as always in the ancient astronaut tradition, is the question you take home. The question about what it means that we needed 9 interventions to get here. The question about what is owed to whoever kept making those interventions possible. The question about whether the species that survived is living up to what was done to ensure its survival. 9 times saved. Here we are. If you made it through all 9, you now know something most who have heard Enki's name never do. Not the name, not the mythology as mythology. The sequence, the shape of what the tablets preserve when you read them, not as poetry about weather and harvest, but as the record of decisions made under pressure, by a being who seems to have understood something about us that we are still working out. The tablets are not complete. The library's burned. The clay survived. 9 interventions, 9 margins, 9 reasons people can still ask why. The next question is yours. The 9 times Enki saved humanity in secret, ranked by how close it was, are not 9 equal events spread evenly across a timeline. They are a shape. The early ones are preparation. The middle ones are crisis management. The final ones are execution under fire. Together they form the complete account of what it cost, in divine political capital and divine oath gymnastics and direct confrontation with the most powerful god in the Sumerian pantheon, to ensure that the thing Enki built and kept building and kept fighting to preserve had a future. The thing being us, the future being now. Read the Atrahasis epic in a good translation if you have not. Jacobson's work, Lambert and Millard, Daly's Myths from Mesopotamia. The texts are available. They are not what the summaries make them sound like. They are stranger and more specific and more detailed and more interesting than any summary of them can convey. The clay preserved things that summaries smooth out. The details are where the pattern lives. The pattern is the argument. The argument is about you. 9 times. The same direction. The same outcome. The tablets say it happened. The clay lasted long enough to tell you. Here you are. The next video continues the work. What the Sumerian texts say about the period after the 9 interventions, about what Enki did when the divine assembly finally accepted the existence of the post-flood human civilization and what that acceptance cost and what it produced, is a question the surviving clay has answers to, not complete answers. Partial ones, encoded in the same compressed symbolic language, pressed into the same durable medium, buried in the same ruins, waiting for the same kinds of questions to be brought to them. We will bring those questions next time. The tablets will be waiting. They have been waiting for 4,000 years. That is the thing about clay. It does not get impatient. The world did not need to have us in it. The divine assembly voted otherwise. One being found 9 ways to make the vote fail. 9 times the margin was something you can name. A party, a feast, 7 sages, 3 reduction failures, a stolen tablet, a strategic refusal, a post-flood rebuild, an oath and a wall, an argument on a mountain, and the moment in the assembly when the oath's language told him exactly what it left out. 9 margins, 9 saves, infinite consequence. You are that consequence. The clay said so first. And that is the fullest account the surviving record supports. That is what 9 interventions looks like when you read them against the actual clay rather than the popular summaries. 4,000 years of clay, waiting for someone to put it all in sequence and ask what it finally adds up to. It all adds up to this. It adds up to you, right here, at the end of 3 hours of Sumerian cosmology, knowing something about the origin and survival of your species that most people alive today have never been told and will not be told unless someone keeps reading the tablets and keeps asking, with the actual cuneiform sources open, what the clay was always trying to say.